Hi, this is the Maverick artist Victor-Hugo reporting modern art gonzo journalism for the modern art music movement. It is July 28th, 2025, reporting from the former Soviet Union, Republic of Georgia, near the border with Russia, Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. My job is not to be politically correct. It is to witness, observe, analyze, and document the beautiful chaos that surrounds us all, so that future generations can understand how we got to this moment in time where I am blessed to be joined by Sage of Quay, aka Mike Williams. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to let the audience know it's been a while since we've been in contact. So, yeah, this interview has been a long time coming. I'm really looking forward to it. For those of you who are unfamiliar with your work, sir, if you could just give a brief introduction for the audience.
Okay, well, Victor-Hugo, I have been doing conspiracy and alternative research going back to, well, I'll start with my blog in 2012, which is still up and running. In fact, I've got two of them. One mirrors the other. And then in 2014, I started my podcasting on YouTube. And I've gotten into all kinds of conspiracy research, alternative research. I've touched on many, many topics. But starting in 2016, I started looking into the conspiracy around the Beatles, starting with the Paul is dead conspiracy. And that evolved into a much larger conspiracy that I was working on and researching. And that occupied much of my time over the last 8.5 years or so. And I retired that research back in November of last year. I felt that 8 years was enough. I felt that I had taken my research full circle. I got everything out that I wanted to get out. And so I didn't want to get into a situation, Victor-Hugo, where it was diminishing returns. In other words, I was just talking about it for the sake of talking about it. So I felt like, okay, well, I've done everything that I believe I can do on this. So now it's time to conclude it and then move on. Although I did say that I would keep my head in the game in the event that something significant takes place with the guy that's playing Paul McCartney, Billy Shears. And then I'll jump back in and I'll do some research or give my perspectives. That's basically it since 2012. It doesn't sound like a whole lot, but there was a whole lot of work between the blog and the podcasting and then the Beatles research, which took a lot of time.
You know, I had a friend who actually met the Paul McCartney, who claims to be Paul McCartney now. It was an interesting interaction because he was in a fancy hotel of sorts, you might say. And he went, knocked on the door, and he was bringing Paul McCartney something that he needed. He went into the room, and after helping Paul McCartney asked my friend, "What's your name, by the way?" And he said what his name was. And then he asked Paul McCartney, "And what's your name?" And Paul McCartney gave him a look like, "You don't know who I am?" And of course, my friend was kidding. But what was interesting was the way that Paul said his name was Paul came naturally. And what I mean by that is if you're an imposter or if you're a clone or if you're somebody pretend to be that person, when I asked him, I said, did he say his name? Did it take him a moment to think about his name, if his name was really Billy Shears? He says, no, it just came out naturally like Paul. What do you suppose that is? Is that part of the brainwashing that they put into the individual who's supposed to be the imposter, that he forgets completely about his past and who he was and his past name and everything?
No, I think it has to do with him playing the part for 60 years. That's a long time. That's 6 decades. So for 60 years, he's been playing the role of Paul McCartney. So his interaction with the fan base and the public outside of his family is that of Paul McCartney. So that doesn't surprise me at all.
Do you think he still goes to his family as Billy Shears? Do they know that he's really not Paul McCartney?
Oh, yeah. His family knows that he's not Paul McCartney. Linda McCartney knew. Heather Mills knew. Nancy, his current wife, knows. His kids obviously know that he's not Paul McCartney. It's It's a role that he plays. And when he's outside of that role, when he's with his family or with his inner circle of friends, he's Billy or William. But outside of that, like I said, with the fan base and the general public, he's Paul McCartney. And because he's been doing it for so long, when people ask him, it just rolls right off the tongue. I'm Paul McCartney.
The reason why I think it's so important to revisit this is because of what's happening now where people are starting to notice. What once was woo or conspiracy theory, people are starting to realize everything from Sandy Hook to the Boston bombing to even the whole Epstein, where you're supposed to believe that it was just a hoax and that there was no list and just forget about it, move on, nothing to see here. How is it that so many people can be involved in a conspiracy? Because that's what it is. And when you see these crisis actors playing the roles of mothers who lost children at Sandy Hook and mothers who lost children at other bombings, and so like who are these people? Are they raised to be crisis actors?
Oh, that's a loaded question because there are multiple facets to it. The way they're able to control it is the control system controls the communication vehicles. So even if you have somebody who opens their mouth or walks off the reservation, nobody's going to hear them. Nobody's going to know about them. And if what they say, which would cut across the grain with regard to official narratives or false flags and stuff like that, they're ridiculed and they're marginalized and they just go away. So the way they're able to keep these conspiracies front and center without whistleblowers and the such coming out and making a lot of noises, they control the narrative. They control the media. They control the government. So that's how it works. Because of their ability to broadcast en masse to millions and millions of people their message, that's the message that is going to get traction. It's not going to be the person that is the dissenter over here or over there. They can jump up and down all they want, but they're not going to get any airtime. And as we've seen here in the United States, if you're a whistleblower, that's not held in high esteem by the controllers. They want to lock you up and put you in a cage. So that whole piece of it, if you're thinking about being a whistleblower, there's a lot of fear connected with that because they're seeing too many examples where people who stepped out, things didn't go so well. So that's how Victor-Hugo, they're able to control the message. And the other piece of it where you have these crisis actors, it's amazing what people will do for money. It's really amazing. So if you pay them well, you have them sign NDAs, contracts, threaten to sue them if they open their mouths, then they're just going to go along with the program. And obviously there are players that are in programs that are tied into the machine. I remember Ole Damagard talking about this many years ago. I forgot the name of the company going back, it has to be about 7 or 8 years ago, that was their area of expertise. That's what they did as a business, was crisis acting and simulations. You know, when you control the machine, when you control the levers and the buttons, you can do a lot.
I can only imagine, because I don't know about you, but I've met people who, when they have a little bit too much to drink or when they're stressed out or when their guard is down, they share secrets. So I can only imagine that before being chosen to be part of these conspiracies, they must do a serious background check. They also must do serious training. They probably do some MK Ultra on these people because they have to make sure that the secret is kept. I can't imagine that the whole family of this Billy Sheen guy, is that his name? Billy
Shears.
Billy Shears. I mean, how do they get everybody? And Linda McCartney, all these people, like, that's so bizarre. Can you explain to me, and for those who don't know, why did they feel that they had to, did they kill Paul McCartney or did he just die of natural causes? What was that whole thing about?
Well, that's subject to debate. I'll take you through my thoughts on it. But the point about the families being involved and how do they do it, all of these families are bloodlined. They are in secret societies. Their world is very different than our world. That's the thing that the audience has to understand. I call it the pyramid of power. They reside within the pyramid of power where you have the family bloodlines, the secret societies, and then we're outside of it. And the two worlds are diametrically opposed. So that's the simple explanation as to how things are kept in place within their families and their inner circle. Now, going back to Paul McCartney, the conspiracy, the prevailing conspiracy says that he died back in late 1966. Now, we're going to get 3 dates. We're going to get, it happened in August of 1966, September of 66, and the other date is November of 1966. Now, in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, which is the book that kicked off my research, it explains that he died on September 11th of 1966, which is a very important date in the occult. Now, the work by another researcher, Sharon Clemens, and Sharon has done some exceptional work. She claims that Paul possibly died back in August of 1966 when the Beatles were touring the West Coast, going into their concerts in Seattle. My personal position on this is I don't spend a lot of time focused on August, September, or November, because from my perspective, dead is dead. And arguing about a 3-month span of time within this conspiracy doesn't seem to be very productive for me. So now, how did he die? Again, the prevailing conspiracy theory says that Paul died in a car crash. Other explanations is that Paul died as a result of a satanic ritual, a ritual sacrifice. And in the book, it's referred to as death for success. So they enter into these Faustian bargains, then there's a sacrifice, and from the world and the minds of an occultist, these ritual sacrifices strengthen the ritual. They make it more powerful. Those are the two that you'll hear most often. The car crash, he died in a car crash. It was an accident. Others will say that he was in a car crash, but it wasn't an accident, that they forced the accident in order to kill him. And then there's a third explanation that says perhaps there was no car whatsoever. He was just whisked off and sacrificed. And this took place in the latter part of 1966. And Billy, from a public perspective, he emerges with the release of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album on June 1st of 1967. And that's the guy that we see. We see Billy on the front cover of the Sgt. Pepper album. With my research, I have discussed that Billy has been in the pipeline, involved with the Beatles, before he was allegedly selected in late 66 to play the part of Paul McCartney. In the book, he explains that he was a studio musician, a seasoned studio musician. He played on many recordings, and I have reason to believe that he was involved with the writing of some of the Beatles songs and playing on some of the Beatles songs going back to the biological Paul period between 1962 and 1966. So that's it at a high level. Paul died in 1966. How he died, there's always going to be a debate about that because there's no direct evidence. Nobody witnessed him dying or being murdered. But in my mind, he's gone. He's no longer with us. Some people will ask, do you think Paul lived beyond 1966? And I said, well, that's possible. Anything is possible. But the guy that's playing Paul McCartney today and the guy that's been playing him since 67 is not Paul McCartney. That's Billy Shears. And there's been a great piece of work done by a fellow researcher, Stacy. We just finished up a show. I just released it 2 days ago. And she has traced Billy's ancestry, his lineage, back to the Douglas Hamiltons, a very powerful blue blood family, back to Scotland on his father's side, and the Percys on his mother's side. So the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys. And her research is very compelling. And how did she get there? She got there because in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, although it is classified as historical fiction, the book is encoded. It's layered. And when you decipher or decode the book, you get to the truth. So you have multiple layers. So the first layer is how you would read any book. And there's a lot of information there at the first layer. But then as you start to strip away and you start to pick up on the clues and the hints that are embedded and layered into the book, it sets you off on a separate path outside the book to go figure some things out. That's what happened to me when I took a look at whether they wrote all their own music or not. That's not in the book per se. There was a hint at the fact that they didn't write all their own music. It's very subtle. I picked up on it and I started to take a look, and I concluded that the Beatles did not write all their own music and they did not play on all of their recorded tracks, especially between the period of 1962 and 1966. The book actually asks intrepid people to go outside the book to get further details, further explanations, verification, and so on. And it also happened with another researcher that I'm connected into, a very good friend and colleague, Sally Whitty, who discovered that Billy Shears is blind in his right eye. So he has an ocular prosthetic in his right eye. He sees with his left only. It's very involved. It's a very, very deep conspiracy. Some people don't get it. They just think, oh, what's the big deal? You know, what if Paul McCartney did die? It's just a guy in a band. Why does it matter with everything else that's going on in the world? Well, this conspiracy contains the ingredients, everything, including the kitchen sink with regard to how the deep state operates and the lengths that they will go to ensure that their psychological operations are successful. And I tied the Beatles back as a creation of the Tavistock Institute. That actually was brought forth by Dr. John Coleman in his book on the Committee of 300 that goes back to the early 1990s. And I pursued that and dug deeper and deeper. And with my research, I said, well, it wasn't just the Tavistock Institute. It's connected back to the Frankfurt School and its Marxist ideology. So the Beatles, they were a big tool in the toolbox of the controllers to force and re-engineer, socially engineer the world towards a Marxist governance across the world. And they were very successful at it. Very successful.
You know, one of the questions I have is with whether he died in a car accident or he died during a satanic ritual, would there be some sort of record, or is that something that, of course, if you control the police and you control the hospitals, you can bury that? Did I just answer my own question there?
They control all of this stuff. So things that we are attached to, because this is the process in the world outside the pyramid, like death certificates, birth certificates, all of this stuff.
They don't have to worry.
They don't have to worry about that stuff.
Yeah.
They can just create what they need to create. They can delete what they need to delete, and they can tell the stories they want to tell because, as I mentioned before, they control all of the communication vehicles.
Getting to the satanic ritual ceremony, how does that work out? Were Ringo, were John, and were George all involved in picking Paul McCartney as the sacrifice? Or how did that work out? Because they must have known. Again, if I was in a band with three other guys and one of them shows up one day, I could tell either by his voice or by his mannerisms or by his height or by his face that something was different. So were they in on it as well? And did they choose Paul as the sacrificial lamb?
Well, the choosing piece wasn't done by the band members. Boy, this is really deep. And there's a lot of information here, so I'm going to do my best to explain it. If we go on the internet and you take a look at images, just type in Paul McCartney birdcage, George Harrison birdcage, John Lennon birdcage. And the reason why the birdcage is important, because in Illuminati culture, Illuminati symbolism, the birdcage symbolizes mind control. It's possible that at least Paul McCartney and John Lennon were in programs. And I'm not discounting the fact that maybe George and Ringo were also, but I think it's likely that John and Paul were in programs. So what does that mean? Well, that means if they were in programs, then they were identified early on in life. Paul lost his mother at 14. John lost his mother at 17. His father, Freddie Lennon, was missing in action. And I suspect this is speculation on my part because there's no written information on this. In fact, there's very little information about Paul McCartney's father, Jim McCartney. If you go look on the internet, you would think that the father of one of the most recognizable and famous entertainers and musicians of all time, that there would be a lot of information on Jim McCartney. Also his mother, Mary McCartney, and there is not. So I have suspected that his father was possibly a Freemason and his handler early on. The reason why I'm giving you all this background, Victor-Hugo, is because Paul McCartney, we could say the same thing about John, but we'll just stick with Paul, was in the pipeline from a long time ago. And he was groomed and they were brought along. And like how many of these programs work, the people who are in the programs, especially when they're young, they're not aware that they're actually in a program. Many times they don't realize this until later on in their life. Yeah, there's one, the birdcage. There you go.
When you type it in, you don't see many, at least not on Brave search. I don't use Google because I don't trust Google, but
Yeah, well, you're not going to find a ton of them, but you're going to find not only the birdcage images, but you're going to find other occult images of the Beatles. One-eyed symbolism, Masonic handshakes. I did a whole presentation on the Beatles and the occult, and I can send you the link so that when you post the show, people can go take a look at it.
do you see what it says about associated with the concept of a birdcage in several contexts? The song "And Your Bird Can Sing" by the Beatles is believed to have inspired photographer Robert Whittaker to create a photo titled "Birdcage." Any of this stuff have to do with what you're talking about?
That's the official narrative nonsense as to why he has a birdcage on his head.
Okay.
It's like when we take a look at the original cover for the Beatles' Yesterday and Today album, which was released in the United States. In fact, you could type in Beatles Butcher album.
Is that the one with the children, the little babies on it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Go.
This is disgusting.
Yeah.
What was this all about?
Well, according to John Lennon, he said that they wanted to do something different, something a little more edgy. They got tired of just doing these bland photo shoots for the album covers. And some people want to argue that the Beatles didn't want to do that album cover. And that is not the case. I have an interview of John Lennon where Lennon was very gung-ho about doing it because, as I just mentioned, it was something very different. It was edgy. And he didn't say the other Beatles didn't want to do it. So, we have the baby parts, and this is indicative again of mind control, the breaking down of the person. Type in the Beatles umbrella.
Wow. Yeah. You really did do your research on this. Did there ever get a point where you were just like kind of really creeped out by this and how this actually fits into your life?
I've explained to my audience many times that it can get very, very dark, and it does get very dark. Take a look at the one to the left there. They're sitting down with the umbrellas.
Yeah.
That's umbrella programming. Umbrella programming also has to do with mind control. Umbrellas are also tied to rain, R-A-I-N. And that goes back to the legend of Rain Man. So the legend of Rain Man is the concept of the Faustian bargain, a deal with the devil. So the umbrellas have two meanings. One, it indicates mind control, and it also indicates the possibility of a Faustian bargain. In the book, in the memoirs of Billy Shears, it tells us that John and Paul entered into a Faustian bargain, a deal with the devil, in October of 1963. And that's
John and Paul.
John and Paul.
Did George and Ringo know about this?
The book doesn't mention George or Ringo.
I wonder how that works, by the way. And you may not know this, but I'm just throwing it out there. If two of the members of the band make a deal with the devil, does that impact the two members who didn't make the deal with the band? But they all seem to benefit from him because Ringo has had an amazing career and so has George.
If Paul McCartney was a ritual sacrifice for the success of the Beatles, not just as a band, but as a social engineering initiative to bring about a new age. It goes back to Aleister Crowley. The Beatles were immersed in Crowley's religion of Thelema and the concepts of Thelema, and the age of Aquarius, what many people refer to as the New Age, Crowley referred to as the Eon of Horus. So the current age, or some people will argue, we're already into the age of Aquarius or the Eon of Horus, was the Piscean age, Crowley referred to as the Eon of Osiris. And so you could see there where Aleister Crowley is in the upper left-hand corner of the Sgt. Pepper album cover. The way I interpret that, the reason why Crowley's in the upper left-hand corner is because it's the left-handed path.
Gotcha.
Okay. Type in With the Beatles album. That's their second album out of the UK. And by the way, folks, their UK releases are their official releases. It is not the US Capitol pressings. So what do we have there? We have the shadow effect. It's one-eyed symbolism.
Yeah. Wow. Right from the beginning.
Right from the beginning.
It's interesting. These guys had Rubber Soul as one of their albums.
Rubber Soul was their sixth release. That's the album that I majored on to show that they did not write all of their own music. Rubber Soul is the silver bullet that proves that they did not write all their own music. And then after that was Revolver. And then after that, there was a Greatest Hits album. And then after that, on June 1st of 67, was Sgt. Pepper. All of these genres of music, all of them, are created by the control system in order to steer the population in a certain direction. So like in the 1970s, we had Kiss. They brought forth a satanic presentation. Jimmy Page was a disciple, an acolyte of Aleister Crowley. And this was not a secret. You'll hear and read stuff about Ritchie Blackmore from Deep Purple, the same thing. And when we take a look at the number of musicians and entertainers and celebrities that pass away at a young age, not all of them are in the 27 Club, but they pass away before their time.
Is the 27 Club just a coincidence, or are those people murdered and sacrificed?
In my mind, they entered into a pact, and at some point, the devil gets his due. You've got to pay up. And I think when they enter into these pacts, they don't know when their time is up. It comes down to when the unseen force decides that your time is up.
By the way, can you connect the dots between the Tavistock Institute creating the Beatles to influence culture to what's happening now in the hip hop and black rap and a lot of the black musicians that are influencing the youth now, selling their souls to Satan and having like black satanic rappers and stuff like that? I don't listen to rap music or hip hop, but I do notice that they've switched the Satanism from heavy metal to rap now. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, well, the Satanism has pretty much always been there. It was a lot more subdued early on. Now, I've explained that. Let me go from here. What this is all going toward, forget about the music industry for now. What this is all moving toward is a worldwide Marxist control system. And if we go back to the Frankfurt School out of Germany, the Frankfurt School came about in the 1920s. They were made up mostly of Jewish intelligentsia, Jewish intellects. In fact, George Lukács, I have a list here, Walter Benjamin, Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, who was involved with the Beatles based upon my research, and also Dr. John Coleman wrote about Adorno being involved in the Beatles' music in his book on the Committee of 300. We have Herbert Marcuse, Eric Fromm. These are all people that were Marxists, and they were bent on implementing a Marxist culture. Now, going back to World War I, we had the Bolsheviks. When the Bolsheviks took Russia, the Marxists, the communists, believed that there was going to be a revolution worldwide, and that didn't happen. And part of the reason why that didn't happen was because the Bolsheviks, their ways of getting things done was brutal. So I refer to that as Lenin Marxism. The Frankfurt School turned around and said, the reason why communism didn't get any traction after the revolution is because you're going about it the wrong way. You have to be a little more subliminal in your ways. You have to subvert from within. You have to implode from within. So we have to infiltrate their society. We have to infiltrate their education. We have to infiltrate their politics. We have to infiltrate their media, their entertainment, their music. We have to infiltrate everything. In fact, there's a quote by Max Horkheimer, who was a main player with the Frankfurt School, and Max said, the revolution won't happen with guns, rather it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move towards universal egalitarianism. So that's a nice way of saying universal Marxism or universal communism. So the reason why I'm putting that picture together is because that then segues into the entertainment industry, the music industry, so Hollywood, television, and music, as major tools in the toolbox of the Marxists, of the control system.
Do you notice that they're using the artificial intelligence to do that now? Have you noticed how the main players at the very top of artificial intelligence happen to belong to the synagogue of Satan? They're really doing what the Beatles did with the youth, only now they're doing it virtually and with the artificial intelligence. They're really going at the youth with that. I find that to be the new Frankfurt School. Do you know if the Frankfurt School is involved with artificial intelligence?
Well, the Frankfurt School technically doesn't exist anymore, but that doesn't mean that the ideology doesn't exist anymore. The ideology is very much alive and well. And the Frankfurt School and Tavistock, they were connected at the hip. As an example, I think it was Kurt Lewin, Lewin, was going between the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. Tavistock is the social engineering headquarters of the control system. That's what they do. The precursor to the Beatles was the Beat movement. So we had people like Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, who, by the way, is on the cover of the Sgt. Pepper album. Billy did a collaboration with Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg was reading some beat poetry, and Billy was playing guitar along with Ginsberg reading his work. Jack Kerouac was another mainstay in the beat movement, and John Lennon was a fan of Kerouac and his work. So the Beats were all about hedonism and the cult of Pan. And Crowley was in the cult of Pan. So when we talk about the cult of Pan, we're talking about if it feels good, do it.
I'm noticing that they're really, pushing this whole satanic realm here on Earth through the art and through the music, through the AI. It seems to be culminating at a faster speed. So were the Beatles the impetus for this? And who had the plan for this? Who said, okay, because what I'm seeing is that your research is now leading us to this present day.
Yes. It's all interconnected. So think of it as a staircase. They kicked it off in the 1960s. That's why they called it the counterculture. And we talked about culture wars. See, the thing is, people, when they talked about culture wars, people never asked, well, what cultures are at war? So the Beatles were introduced in order to break down traditional family values and to break away from institutionalized religions, specifically Christianity, because the control system, which is pagan-based, views Christianity as a major obstacle for them to move forward. So they had to break it down. And I would argue they were very successful in doing that from the perspective of breaking down traditional family values and also taking apart institutionalized religions, with the dominant one in the United States, at least, being Christian values.
Now, I see today a predominance of what have become known as satanic Christians, those who claim to be Christians but are actually having gay, homosexual, transgender pedophiles in their churches as pastors, and people who are claiming that it's what Israel is doing in Palestine is completely okay, and that God chose them to genocide non-Jews. And I don't know, like these really bizarre Christians. They're even promoting pornography. The person who is the main Christian leader in the Trump administration is a woman. And there's footage, I've played it, of her and her husband talking about how it's okay for Christians to watch porn together. There's no other way to describe it as satanic Christians. It seems like, again, the natural evolution of what the Tavistock Institute and the Frankfurt School wanted to do to Christianity, where they now think that watching porn with your gay lover and having your husband be a cuck is okay with Jesus Christ?
Yes, this is the subversion from within. Now, we're going to have Christians who are listening to this, and they're going to be probably very taken back by this and upset about what I'm explaining here. And it's not a knock against you personally if you have traditional Christian values. What I'm talking about is they have subverted Christianity by creating various sects, S-E-C-T-S, within the Christian umbrella. And going back to what Victor-Hugo was just discussing. So they insert variations of the Christian faith. And what's happened now is the Christian faith as a whole becomes diluted. That is their goal. Their goal is to dilute it. Because when you dilute something, it's no longer concentrated. It's no longer strong. So that's their approach. Let me just do this. I pulled a chart out here. I'll just read from it, Victor-Hugo, if you don't mind. This might help put some of this into perspective. So we're talking about the Frankfurt School. As I mentioned, it was comprised of Marxist intellectuals, and it was in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, and they left Germany during World War II in fear that they were going to be locked up. So what did they do? They went to the United States. So they went from Germany to the United States. They just moved their shop across the pond. So with cultural Marxism, which is what the Frankfurt School was all about, we're talking about subversion from within. So there are synergies between the Protocols of Zion and Frankfurt's critical theory ideology, which was put forth by Theodor Adorno. Now, what is critical theory? So critical theory divides the masses into two categories, oppressors and victims. And the intent was to destabilize society and destroy the oppressive order. So as an example, they told women back in the 1960s during the counterculture that you are being oppressed by your husband. I'm not saying that in some cases the relationships didn't operate like that, but what they did through their media and their constant pounding of the message through the media is to make that statement appear to be the majority of situations. The majority of women were being oppressed or suppressed by their husbands, by the patriotic structure. And so it becomes larger than life. In other words, it's completely exaggerated. We saw this with the whole thing with transgender. So a very minuscule piece of the population has a problem understanding and coming to grips with their gender, which at one time was considered to be a mental health disorder. And then they just changed it. They just magically changed it, said, no, it's not a disorder anymore. But what they did, my point is they take something that is not a big problem in society, and they magnify it to the point where the impression is by the receiver of the information through the media that it is a major problem.
Don't you think part of the reason they do that is to distract us from the fact that people are noticing that at the very highest levels of all governments, we're being led by psychopathic pedophiles and cannibals?
One of their tactics is to deluge the public with information. When we talk about information, there's good information, there's bad information, and there's everything in between. So when you get deluged with such a wide variety of information, it causes people to fight and debate because they end up in camps. Let me just say this because I've mentioned this in a number of shows. Tavistock is very, very good at what they do. Okay, they have been doing it a long time. Very good at what they do, but there's two things that they do really, really well. One is they reduce the critical thinking capacity of an adult to that of a child. When a child thinks, it's based in emotions. They're emotional about it. And we see this all the time in the public discourse. People react emotionally. I see it all the time when I was doing my Beatle work. People would get irate and agitated, and they would type out comments, Victor-Hugo, that it was all emotions. It was as if a 12-year-old was having a rant. Now, the other thing that Tavistock does is they create cults. That means they put people in buckets. This is what all your social media is about. So if you're sitting on social media and you're typing on Facebook and putting up all kinds of posts and I'm over here and I'm over there and I voted for this person and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. What you're doing is you're feeding the beast, giving them lots of information about you. And so what happens is they put you in buckets, and you're categorized. Now they know how to manage you. Now they know what buttons to push to get a reaction out of you or to steer you in a certain direction. This is what they're really good at. Creating these cults, creating these buckets and putting people in them. And as they're doing this, they're also reducing their intellectual capacity down to that of a little kid. So going back to the Frankfurt School, talking about Adorno's critical thinking, it dissects existing societal beliefs and criticizes them in a way to redefine existing beliefs. So they criticize values, they try to tear it down, and then they present an alternative to you. Why are you doing that? Why are you staying home as a mom and watching the kids? You're a housewife? Remember, that was a derogatory way of trying to demean women. You're a housewife? I mean, you don't want to go off to work? You don't want to go do what your husband's doing? And so they were pummeling the wives and the moms with this message to tear down the traditional beliefs. I've said this on many shows. Many women, I'm not saying all women, many women were very satisfied with their roles, traditional roles of raising children and maintaining the home, while the husband, the father, went out and kept a roof over everybody's head and made sure that the food was on the table. They took the traditional majority view and they turned it upside down on its head, as I was talking about before, because they used the media to make it larger than life. This is a problem. We have a problem. Women are being stifled at home. So this then led to daycare, preschool, before school, right? Because now the mom wants to go to work. So the kids are in some kind of care before they go to school, then they go to school, then after school they go to like a latchkey program or some after school program. So for a good 12 hours of the day, the kids are not being influenced by their biological parents. God only knows who's saying what to these kids and shaping their minds with whatever message that these people, whether intentionally or not, are putting through to little children. Their little heads are like mush, and then they're going to look to mold them, especially when we get to school.
What you're describing is the disaster that has led to this current state that we're in of complete confusion, chaos, distrust, disunity, and hatred and fear. Wow.
Yes.
The change that they did on purpose. And when I say they, people get upset at me when I say it's the Jews, but realize when you follow the money, because none of this is possible without financing.
Yep.
And you're right, because the children are being influenced, taken from one place to another with people who really don't care about them.
No.
I mean, there's parents who don't care about children. Imagine being a teacher getting paid minimum wage, or some of these teachers have ulterior motives. It's like if you're a pedophile, you want to get a job at a school because that's where the kids are. So it's just incredible. And then you see how the kids grow up to be pedophiles. And that's why now they're normalizing pedophilia, because there's so many pedophiles out there because they've been pedophiled that they're like, okay, we got to normalize this. And so again, it goes back to, from what I've been studying, the Talmud, which states that even the best of non-Jews should all be killed and show no mercy to the non-Jews. And then the idea that they want to bring back those who call themselves Jews but are not, are of the synagogue of Satan, the father of all lies. They're trying to bring back the Antichrist so that they can rebuild the third temple. And then when you hear Benjamin Netanyahu speak about using the United States and bleeding it dry, using all its resources, and then getting rid of Edom, because it's all inversion. So even though the United States is not Edom, they're claiming it's Edom. They want to destroy Edom so that the Antichrist can come back. And then since they had the Council of Nicaea and rewrote the Bible, and then with King James and him needing a divorce, he wrote the Bible and then taking things out of the Bible, putting things in to make these satanic Christians believe that if you do whatever the God's chosen people say, that Kung Fu Jesus will come back and he will kick everybody's ass and he will save you and he will bring you up to heaven and everything will be great. I mean, it's such a ridiculous story. You're right. These people are dealing with emotion, and so we're in trouble.
The human race is in trouble. I'm not going to paint a pretty picture. Are people becoming more aware? Yes. Are people waking up? Yes. Are people, quote, noticing? Yes. But the systems that are in place for society have been infiltrated to such a point that, in my view, it's going to take a miracle to turn it around. So there is a Jewish control system, folks. Okay. So there's no beating around the bush with this stuff. A lot of people want to argue it's the Jesuits, it's the Jews, it's the Jews, it's the Jesuits. Look, right now, we're dealing with a Jewish control system. And what I've explained to folks is that the pyramid of power is made up of a federation of bloodlines and secret societies. And the Jewish segment of that is in that pyramid as part of the bloodlines and part of the secret societies. And I would argue at the upper echelon of that pyramid. They view us as what is referred to as the Amalekites out of the Bible, which were the enemies of the Jews. And the intent of the Jews with regard to the Amalekites is to erase them.
Even their pets, their cattle, their sheep, to leave no remnant of their culture in existence, which is interesting because I'm sure you've studied this, the erasure of our history. That's why you see these hidden underground cities. There's a lot of floods that have occurred to erase cities that have existed, books that have been burned and kept secret. So there's so much knowledge that they keep from us, but they have this knowledge.
Yes, they have this knowledge. This information has been distorted, bastardized, and kept from us. The Frankfurt School recommended the creation of racial divides, continual change to create confusion. This is what I was talking about before, flooding the zone with information, good, bad, or indifferent, to keep them off balance. Teaching sex and alternative sexual lifestyles to children. This is the whole transgender thing with kids in elementary school. It's just unbelievably twisted. But we could see how far gone most of society is in that the school systems allowed this, along with books that should never, ever be in a school library. Undermining the authority of the schools and the teachers, promoting excessive drinking and drugs, emptying the churches. Going back to what I said before about going after Christianity. And I'm not a Christian, by the way, folks, okay? So just so you know, I present this as a statement of fact. I'm just telling you what my research has uncovered. They want to create and have created an unreliable legal system, dependency on the state, controlling the media to dumb down people, obviously, and encouraging the breakdown of the family. The Frankfurt School promoted pansexualism. This is the cult of Pan I was talking about before, where the tagline is, if it feels good, do it. It's also the Nike tagline, just do it. That all goes back to the cult of Pan. Aleister Crowley was in the cult of Pan. And what is the cult of Pan? It's the search for pleasure. It's the hedonism that I was talking about when I was referring back to the Beat movement. They want to marginalize the role of the father. They want to abolish male dominance. They wanted to remove the parents as the primary educators in the family, obfuscate the difference between genders. So this whole thing with transgenderism, as I've been trying to explain to my audiences, it's not new. This is something that they have been formulating and strategizing about for a very long time. They would use music to promote mental illness and destroy society. And if I'm not mistaken, it was Bertrand Russell who said that they wanted to produce an unshakable conviction that snow is black. So what they mean by that is they want to condition and indoctrinate people to believe something that otherwise would be unbelievable. And this goes back to what people believe about that whole bit we went through with the woke movement, where they were saying that men can breastfeed, men can give birth to babies. It's total nonsense. It's completely and totally illogical. Yet we have segments of the population that believe this. Again, it goes back to what I said before. They're able to promote this type of nonsense through the control of the media, which they own. They own the media. So people are constantly being hypnotized and brainwashed through the television sets. Adorno, based upon my research, had said that they could promote a culture of pessimism and despair via the radio and television. And the Frankfurt network extends into eugenics, the Fabians, population control, sexual and family law reforms. It is linked to publishing houses, medical, educational, research establishments, women's organizations, marriage counseling, governments, etc. So the point is that the Frankfurt School is extremely, extremely important and extremely influential. I consider them to be very foundational to everything leading up to what we're experiencing today.
As a podcaster, I find it mind-numbing when I share these realities with people by having guests like you on a show. Rather than doing something about it, what they do is they hide behind a fake name and avatar and attack the messenger. Yeah. Like you and I are somehow the bad guys for letting them know. So we have allowed ourselves to be enslaved. I mean, think about this. Bertrand Russell says this out loud. The social psychologist of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. And that's what's happening now.
Yes.
And what's weird, Mike, is if you've noticed, these police officers, rather than arresting these psychopaths who are openly destroying society and doing it under NGOs or under philanthropic means, they go after, I don't know if you've heard of a gentleman named, well, his nickname is Son of Enos, and he's been jailed and held in a maximum security prison without bail and without a hearing for now almost a month, and simply because he's noticing. And what's astounding to me is I've sent press releases out to over 168 so-called alternative news media influencers, truth tellers, people in the mainstream news media. I've been sending press releases out because his mother contacted me and said, please help my son. He's in jail for noticing. No other crime. And he's being held with terrorists in a maximum security prison, with psychopaths, with murderers, with rapists. And I'll tell you what, none of the people except for Max Egan, Jeff Berwick, Stefan Verstappen, Dustin Nemos, and myself are reporting on this. Stu Peters, Mike Adams, SGT report, X22 report, Jim Fetzer, all these people who claim to be free speech advocates are completely silent on this, and nobody's saying anything about it. So it really makes you wonder, are these people really for free speech, or what's going on? I don't get it. Mike, what do you see going on?
Where is this person? Where is he being held? What country?
In Canada. He's being
in Canada.
A Canadian. If it's happening in Canada, pretty soon it's going to happen in the U.S. The problem that I'm seeing as a podcaster reporting news that nobody else dares to touch because they're afraid to, is that, like exactly what you said, the Frankfurt School has managed to make the justice system not only neutered, but corrupt. So how are we going to get out of this mess if the children are dumbed down, the children are brainwashed to believe that the snow is black, the judges and the cops and the military are all traitors working for the dollar and for the central bankers rather than working for their brothers and sisters and their neighbors and their own children? I mean, we're in a mess that I'm not meaning to blackbill people, but how are we going to get out of this?
Well, it's a very, very difficult situation. And the reason why is because so many people, even though they don't think they are still playing in the game. So if you're still in that left-right paradigm, you're not awake. If you don't realize, and I've talked about this a long time ago. I mean, I did shows with Deanna Spingola going back years ago, and I talked about how the United States is under foreign occupation. And I've talked about this for a long time. I've had conversations with family and friends and anybody who wanted to talk about it, and they just don't believe it. Oh, what are you talking about? You talk about dual citizenship. Oh, what's the big deal? What's the big deal?
Let it go, they say. Let it go. Just let it go.
There was an interview done by a lady, Kay Griggs, going back into the 90s. It's like 7 or 8 hours long. I have it on my main YouTube channel. And, she was very brave. She came out. Her husband was part of the deep state. He was a colonel in the United States Marines, and she spilled the beans on a lot of stuff. And I have to tell you, when I first watched that years ago, I thought to myself, she had a lot of courage to go out and talk about the things that she talked about. So what's the fix, folks? The fix is you really, really have to wake up. You have to stop holding on to threads of stuff because you just don't want to believe that it can go in that direction. Understand that it's gone in that direction. It's where we're at right now.
We're already there.
Yeah.
We're actually past that point because now artificial intelligence has taken over.
Yeah, AI is going to do all the heavy lifting for the control system. So all of the compliance and all of that stuff. Social credit scores are going to be a real deal. Digital currency is coming. Digital identification passports is coming. It's just a matter of a little bit of time. It's going to be here. There was never any intention of going after the deep state. There was never any intention of draining the swamp because Trump is part of the swamp. He was born and bred into that system. And whenever I brought that up, a lot of people really got upset because, see, people have savior mentality. They think somebody's going to ride up on a white horse, is going to swoop them up, and is going to take them to the goal line. And that's just not the case. You're being duped every single day, 24/7 into perpetuity, unless you wake up. I did 2 videos going back to July of last year that had to do with the staged event at Butler, Pennsylvania, with the quote assassination.
Wow. Did you see the recent interview between Jeff Berwick and Sean from SGT Report?
No.
Holy cow. Jeff Berwick, in the most subtle of ways, really exposed Sean from SGT, who a lot of people once used to respect, and I was a guest on his show twice, but he still believes the whole Butler, Pennsylvania thing.
Yeah.
And Jeff Berwick told him something. He's like, these assassins, they don't miss. People think it's still a miracle that, like, his ear is. You know what? I've had a shaving that I did that took longer to heal than his ear.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, the whole thing was staged. And, because of my Beatle work, I got very much into occult numerology, occult symbolism, and the Butler, Pennsylvania event was loaded up with occult symbolism and numbers. The number around Trump is the number 7. And when I was breaking down the events in Butler, the number 7 was popping up everywhere. It's tied to Trump. It's tied to J.D. Vance. It's connected to a lot of what went on that day. The number 7 in Jewish mysticism and the Kabbalah refers to perfection at the human level. It's the number below the number 8. Obviously, number 8 is perfection at God's level when we talk about the Kabbalah. So I knew then what was going on. I knew that Trump was going to be placed back in the White House because he was the 45th president. 4 plus 5 is 9. And he's the 47th, 11. Trump is a 9/11 event. And I have presented this to my audience, Victor-Hugo, many times. Whenever you see the numbers 9 and 11 together, what is being communicated out is a major transformational event, that something big is going to happen. Some big change is going to take place, some transformational change it's going to be big. Then Trump had the hats made. People were, the knuckleheads were walking around with 45 and 47 on it. What they were walking around with is 9/11 on their heads. I knew it right away, so I called it back then. I said, nope, he's going to be put back in the White House, and here's his job. His job is going to be to corral the constitutionalists and the nationalists. He's going to be their Pied Piper, and he's going to lead them right off the cliff. Honestly, there's a lot of stuff that he talks about that if it were anybody else, like it was Joe Biden's administration talking about it, or whoever was playing the part of Joe Biden, the MAGA base would not agree with it. They wouldn't buy into it. They wouldn't support it. But he could take these very same talking points, and they love it. Now, the thing is, the Epstein thing has caused a big dent in his base. But what I'm waiting to see is what it amounts to at the end of the day. Because we go back to the P. Diddy trial, right? I had predicted back then people were talking about, oh, they've got Sean Combs, and, he's going away. And I said, no, 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 no. What they do is they have certain people they throw under the bus in order to get you distracted and to get you to talk about that incessantly, right? I mean, you had all these YouTube channels and all these alt-right channels talking about it, talking about it, talking about it. And then at the end of the day, what happens? He gets a slap on the wrist. I'm waiting to see what happens now with the whole Trump thing. What's going to happen now that Ghislaine Maxwell has stepped out of prison and allegedly has been deposed? I personally think that she's got him in a situation perhaps where it's blackmail. In other words, you're going to have to pardon me if you want to be off the hook. I think he thinks he's going to ride it out, and he might, because within the public, there's so much apathy. After a while, what happens is if something is continued to be played on YouTube, on the news, on the radio, in magazines and newspapers or whatever, people start to glaze over, and then they don't care anymore. They kind of just move on. And if something does happen, let's just say that something happens where they impeach him, or I don't know, something happens where he has to leave office. You got J.D. Vance behind him. And J.D. Vance is, like Trump, a huge Zionist. So nothing's going to change. You're going to see a different head in a suit in the Oval Office. But as far as the plans go, the strategy goes, nothing's going to change. So I know it sounds like really doom and gloom, and I apologize for that, folks. It's just that I'm like everybody else who thinks about this stuff. You try to think, like, how is this going to play out? And I just see most people, they don't care. I mean, they say people care when you go on YouTube and you're watching your favorite YouTube channel that does political discussions or does conspiracy research. They talk about it, and those people are interested. But when you go out to John Q. Public, like if you went to the supermarket and you talked about the Jeffrey Epstein situation and Trump, I'll bet you most people wouldn't know what you're talking about, or they would say, oh, yeah, I heard something about that. Do you have an opinion on it? No, not really. I have to go pick up cornflakes in aisle 4. That's where people's heads are at. There's a lot of apathy, and that's what concerns me.
Man, talk about apathy. What's amazing is you start to realize how what we're watching is really a show. I don't know if you've seen that segment on CBS News 60 Minutes where the Mossad says, we are the producers, we are the directors, we have the script writers, the world is our stage. So you realize if the United Slaves of Israel don't care about children being tortured, being trafficked, being sexually in satanic ritual abuse ceremonies, and then being cannibalized, that how is it possible that, I don't know if you remember, but when the fake news media made it seem like Trump had a Muslim ban on travelers, all of a sudden, thousands of people showed up at the airports and blocked the highways and were in front of the airports saying, let the Muslims in. And it was nothing more than just people being held at customs for an extra 2 to 3 hours. Same thing with George Floyd, a guy who raped a woman who was pregnant at gunpoint while robbing her home, and who died of fentanyl overdose. He didn't die of a knee to the neck. People were looting, people were killing, they caused billions of dollars worth of damage. But for children being cannibalized and sexually abused, nothing. There's nobody out on the streets saying protect the children. The point that I'm making is, yeah, the people don't care about the children, but they care about a guy who raped a woman at gunpoint while she was pregnant, or they care about some Muslims being held an extra 2 hours at customs. None of that makes any sense. And then when they come knocking on your door because they say, hey, wait a minute, we noticed that you noticed because you posted something on Facebook, so we're here to arrest you, then they start complaining. I think there's something up with the frequency too, Mike. Have you noticed that? A lot of the frequency is so low right now that it's doing exactly what you said earlier. People are not acting on like critical thinkers. They're acting on emotion. And these are people like Dan Bongino, who people respect. I even had the boxer, David Nino Rodriguez. He contacted me because I have information about the Diddy that nobody was talking about. because it just so happens that I had a personal relationship with Michael Simpkins, the owner of Club 11, which was where Diddy used to procure his victims. It's a 24-hour strip club in Miami within just a short distance from Diddy's Star Island mansion, where he would have the freak-off parties.
Yeah.
So what I uncovered in my research was what nobody else was noticing, the Jewish connection to Diddy. Because Diddy was born a poor black kid, and he didn't just make billions of dollars with his ebonics and his stealing other people's music. He was backed by Jews. Because what happened was Epstein was used to get the central bankers, the business people, the white guys who don't want to hang out with the black guys with gold teeth, and the hoes and the bitches and, the pimps and the yo who speak Ebonics. No, different crowd. But they also needed to influence the black. So what they did was they got Michael Simpkins to have his Club 11, which again with the symbolism, the number 11.
Yeah.
It turns out he's the community leader for the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. Then when I start looking into the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, it's a Mossad hub. Why? Because it's close to the airport in Miami. The Jews have a big community in Miami. I used to live in that area. I said, David, he goes, well, what's your take on Diddy? I said, I noticed you're not talking about the Jewish connection to that. I said, the Mossad is what's influencing Diddy, and they're doing the blackmail that they did with Epstein, only they're doing it with the blacks, Drake and these other people. And as soon as I told him that, he was like, whoa, I can't touch that. So it's like, wait a minute. The people in the so-called alternative news media, they'll focus on the blacks, they'll focus on the illegal immigrant Mexicans, but they won't focus on the HIAS, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society or whatever, that gets the money from the government, and then they pay these NGOs, which are the satanic Christians, to cover their workup. But ultimately, it was Alejandro Mayorkas and Merrick Garland and Anthony Blinken, who were all Jews. The same thing with the Trump administration. It's all Jews. But you can't talk about the Jews. So let's talk about the blacks. And let's talk about the Mexicans. But let's not talk about the Jews, who are letting in the blacks and the Mexicans and are doing the Kalergi plan. And then, that's what I've discovered doing these podcasts and being on different shows and inviting other guests on my show. I'm like, wow, man, most of them, unfortunately, are either shills or controlled opposition.
For some people, especially if they have large channels or larger channels, it's a source of income and they don't want to lose that. So certain topics they stay away from because they believe if they talk about it, someone's going to come after them, shut their channel down, demonetize them and stuff like that. So see, what happens is, Victor, the audience has a knee-jerk reaction to it. They recoil from it. So right now, we're having this conversation. There's going to be people that maybe not your audience so much, maybe a little bit of mine, because they're used to me talking about the Beatles. And even though I've talked about the Frankfurt School and it being comprised of Jewish intelligentsia, I think that goes right over most of their heads. But other people are just going to shut down. As soon as you you say the word Jew or Jewish, they shut down.
Why?
And because of indoctrination. They've been inculcated with the premise that you just don't talk about it. They're God's chosen people, and we don't talk about God's chosen people. We don't do that. When you go to school as a kid, you're educated on all these things, you're indoctrinated on all this stuff, and it becomes part of your belief system. And so when somebody talks about it in a way that cuts across the grain, cuts across what you were taught, they put their hands up like, nope, I'm not going to listen to this. I don't want to hear it. That's what I think. In fact, I know that's a big problem because there were times when I've talked about it. And like I said, I talk about it in a very civil way, and I will get comments. You're an anti-Semite. You're this. You're that. Obviously, you're not able to have this conversation. You don't want to think through it. You don't want to logic through it. You don't want to hear another point of view. In Europe, it's a thought crime.
And in Canada, too.
So what does that tell you? So I think a lot of that is what's playing into, I'm not saying that some of these people are not on the payroll, they're not shills or whatever. We've had situations where some of these large podcasters went and had a meet and greet with Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah.
What was that all about?
Yeah. Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Tim Poole. I mean, it's just incredible. I'm saddened the more I learn about the people in this community that I'm in, because we
Well,
should really be united and there should be more solidarity.
it's completely fractured. It's been infiltrated every which way from Sunday. And, in my view, the number of voices who are just honest people giving honest views and trying to present honest research, I mean, I think that that's a very small minority. The YouTube stuff, the social media stuff has become the new mass media. People aren't listening to NBC, ABC, CBS anymore, or Fox News or CNN or MSNBC. I mean, there are people still listen to it, but that population of subscribers and listeners is dwindling day by day. And then you
That's
go
the
to
older generation. I
that's the
believe that's in
right,
the late 60s, 70s, 80s who still
right.
believe those talking heads. The younger generation, which is what I am appealing to, as much as I look like a Santa Claus here with the white beard, I'm reaching out to the youth because, like I said at the beginning of my show, my job is not to be politically correct. I'm the artist. I'm not the judge. I'm not the jury. I'm not the executioner. I'm just the witness. So if I invite you on my show, it's not to judge you. That's not my job. It's to hear what you have to say and ask you questions. And the judge is the court of public opinion. They're the ones who say, hey, you know what? Your guest was honest. Your guest was a bullshitter. Your guest was whatever. That's not my job. My job is to be here and have a conversation with you, which is interesting. I noticed that people in the comments section, when they're hiding behind, they talk as if they have, call them keyboard cowards, and they think they're keyboard warriors. You would never have a conversation like that with somebody face to face,
No.
with the comments that they say.
Yeah.
And then they get mad at me for being, kind to my guests. I'm like, well, what do you want me to do? Start yelling at my guests? I mean,
I've explained that too. When I've hosted shows, people will say, well, you didn't do this. You didn't say that. You didn't. I said, hey, I'm the host. I'm here to facilitate the conversation.
yeah.
Let's ask some questions, probe a little bit. But my job is so the guests can get their research out, their message out. Okay? I mean, that's my job. And it's up to you as the audience to decide whether it resonates with you or not. Plain and simple. I mean, if you want to have a face-off and you want to have an argument, I'll tell you what, you do a podcast, you be the host, you invite them on and argue with them. Okay?
Yeah.
So
you'll never get a guest on your show.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants, you know what I'm saying? The whole point is to have like a fun time. I mean, we're having fun. I'm having fun. I hope you're having fun.
Yeah, no.
I'm learning, But I mean, if I'm just going to come on your show and you're just going to be constantly browbeating me, I'm like, what the hell? I'm not going to go on that guy's show.
And I've run up against that. I've had people want to have me come on their shows. And the first thing about the Beatles, and the first thing I will ask them is, what is your position, your stance on the conspiracy? Because what I want to do is I want to have a conversation with somebody that has at least some semblance of an understanding of what it's about, what the impacts are to society based upon what the conspiracy is about, social engineering. I'm not going to go on somebody's show that wants to defend the official narrative and argue and debate with me. First of all, I've told people, I used to be in that audience. I was a Beatle freak. I believed the official narrative one time. I was drinking the Kool-Aid. I was a Beatle freak. So anything you're going to tell me, I've already heard it. It's not new news. So I want to make sure it's an intelligent adult conversation between two people, whether I'm the host or the guest. That's how I approach it. And it sounds like you're the exact same way. And what I was talking about before, Victor-Hugo, about the old media versus the new media, what I'm saying is the controllers transitioned from the old media to the new media, the social media platforms like YouTube, BitChute, Rumble, and so on, to get their message out. And let's face it, there are influencers out there. That's why they call them, quote, influencers, that are on the payroll, or they are incentivized to discuss certain points, to have certain conversations. And it's up to the audience to discern whether you believe that person is in that category. Because if they are, then you really have to be careful about what it is that they're telling you. Going back to the Mossad for a moment, their motto is, by way of deception, thou shalt make war. Just an
Yeah.
FYI, okay? So
I want to get back to why you and I came together here. I understand what you did. I listened to some of your shows, so I'm aware of the fantastic research that you did. I want to bring what you learned into the present day and how that was planned, because everything is planned. So can you go back again to the whole reason why they had to do the either sacrifice or whatever with Paul McCartney, how they were able to get somebody, from what I understand, he was taller than the real Paul McCartney, looked different, but how did they get him to be like with wings and these other projects that he did? Was he more talented than the real Paul McCartney? How did they find somebody that's so close to looking like him, and then on top of that to be so talented? How is that possible?
okay, so going back to the first part of your question, there's two parts to this. There's the social engineering aspect, and then there's the occult aspect. And the social engineering and the occult, they converge. Okay, so the first step to take with regard to understanding the Beatles and what they were all about and why they were put together, they were the first band to social engineer at a worldwide level. And their mission was to, as I mentioned much earlier on in our conversation, was to break down traditional values and religion. And when I talk about religion, especially in the United States, we're talking about Christianity. So that's the first piece of it. Now, behind the scenes, these controllers, I tell my audience, I explain to them that the world is run by occultists. It's not run by presidents or prime ministers or any of that nonsense, by occultists. And so occultists engage in the occult. When we talk about occultism, it's numbers, it's astrology, it's alchemy. Alchemy is very important to them. Rituals, symbolism, it's the whole ball of wax. Now, ritual sacrifice, as I mentioned earlier, they believe, and when I say they, I'm talking about the occultists in the upper echelon of this control system, believe that a ritual sacrifice is necessary in order to make a particular action or a particular direction, make it more successful. It puts more power behind it. That's why they have it's the same thing with their sigils and their numbers. Their intent is to take your intent, your focus, your consciousness, and focus it on what it is that they're doing or what their objectives are. Okay, that's what they do. They believe that the more focus, the more attention that you give something, the more power is given to whatever it is that they have you focusing on. And with a ritual sacrifice, again, it goes with the word sacrifice. They're sacrificing. When you make a sacrifice, you're sacrificing for something. What are you sacrificing for? What is it that you're looking to get? What is it you're looking to gain? We're looking to gain success in our efforts to transform and social engineer the societal landscape across the world. So the sacrifice would mean, like I mentioned earlier in the book, it's referred to in the memoirs of Billy Shears, death for success. The sacrifice of Paul McCartney, if it was a ritual sacrifice, okay, just if, I don't know for sure, I have no way of knowing, I wasn't there, I didn't participate in the ritual. The sacrifice would make the Beatles larger than life. They would make the Beatles the preeminent band that is the foundational to all the other genres of music that followed after them. Make them a very powerful force. And that powerful force, there's an agenda behind that powerful force. And the agenda was to transform traditional values, religion, ways of life, lifestyles, morals, ethics, the whole nine yards. Now, people will say, well, the Beatles music was great music. It was. To this day, I will still put on a Beatles record to listen to it, but I listen to it through a different lens. It's music with an agenda. It's to push you in a certain direction. It's like when John Lennon in 1966 said, I'm going to paraphrase, the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. That wasn't John just talking off the cuff. I've told my audience, my opinion is that was completely scripted as part of the mission of the Beatles to break down institutionalized religion, that being Christianity. There's a lot of stuff like that. Now, as far as finding Billy. Billy, based upon my research, wasn't found. Billy was in the pipeline. So when they do these big psychological operations, when they look to move the ball forward in a big way, there's a lot of lead-in going into when they pull something off. It could be years, it could be decades, or whatever. Based upon the research that Stacy did, Stacy's a colleague of mine, and again, we just dropped I think a very, very good presentation that she did. She explains that Billy's lineage goes back to the Scottish blue bloods of the Douglas Hamiltons on his father's side and the Percys. In the book, it tells us that Billy, his earliest memory of being in a trauma-based mind control program goes back to when he was 3 years old. And he also says that he was tutored by Aleister Crowley for 10 years. So Billy was born in 37, Crowley died in 47. So there's the 10-year span of time. Now, when we talk about being tutored by Crowley, it may not be Crowley directly, although it could be, but it could be from people who are, for lack of a better term, priests within the religion of Thelema. They're Thelemites. So they're taught in the ways of Thelema. Crowley's book 77, he talks about pursuing one's pure and true will. That's what it's all about. And that's the Luciferian philosophy, by the way, is to pursue your pure and true will. Luciferians believe that they must invest in themselves, going inward to develop, create, and understand what their true and pure will is, what it is that you want to accomplish in life, what it is you want to be, what do you want to aspire to. Once they master that, then what they do is they look to create an external world that mirrors their internal world. So there's a match. Whereas most people, and they refer to us as the profane, do the exact opposite. They take the external world, which was created for them, and I call it pop culture. It's a simulation, really. It's a simulation we call pop culture. And the average Joe and Jane take the external world, the pop culture, and they bring it in, and they think that that's their will. That's not your will. You didn't create that. You just assimilated what was out there, and you brought it in and you embraced it. You don't have a clue what your true and pure will is. So anyway, I bring that up because Billy, he's in a completely different world than you or I are in. His upbringing, his education, what he had to go through to place him to be where he ended up being. Now, these people, these A-list players that we see, they are groomed and handled along the way to be in positions of prominence and influence. So I believe that Billy was being brought along, and he was brought along with extremely good musical talent. In fact, in the book, it says that he was considered a musical prodigy. I talked about how I thought that Paul McCartney may have been in a program, him and John Lennon and possibly George and Ringo, and they were groomed and handled and brought along. So what I'm saying is the creation of the Beatles is something that was in the pipeline. It was a strategy. They have different people identified as to who's going to come in at certain times, who's going to page in and page out at certain times. They figure out how this is going to coalesce and how it's going to sail forward. So what they did was the Beatles came out with their first album, Please Please Me, and the deep state, the control system made sure that it was very successful. And then they went to John and Paul and said, how do you like the success? Great, I love it. You want more? Yeah, of course we want more. Well, if you want more, it's a little something you got to do. And that little something would be the Faustian bargain. How that pact is done, I have no idea. And again, that's if a pact was done. Do I personally believe that something took place? I do. But I'll let the audience decide for themselves. So they took that pact in October of 63. That led into the release of their second UK album with the Beatles, which was also highly successful. And then, of course, everything after that. Beatlemania started in 1963. If you read Tommy James's book, Tommy James and the Shondells, I have Tommy's book, there's a page in there where he talks about in late 1963, he remembers, because he's from the States, he remembers seeing placards and little signs talking about the Beatles are coming, the Beatles are coming, they're coming to the U.S. This was in 1963, and he was like, who are they? So the Beatles hit the American shores on February 7th of 1964, which, by the way, is encoded with 9/11, the numerology. I won't take you through all the math, but trust me on it. and it was called Beatle mania. A mania is a heightened sense of behavior. It's not even like your normal behavior. It's very heightened. You're hyped up. And that's why they called it Beatlemania. I mean, there's many stories where the girls that were screaming and yelling and all that stuff, at the beginning, Tavistock paid these girls to carry on because they know how humans behave. Humans mirror and they emulate. So when they're in a crowd and everybody's screaming and yelling, the people that are paid, right, to scream and yell, the others are looking around and all of a sudden they now assimilate this behavior and they're doing the same thing. And it got to the point where they no longer had to do that. It was just the sheer presence of going to a Beatle concert or seeing the Beatles where people would react this way. This again has to do, it's the psychiatry and the psychology of all of this. The book tells us that as Paul was getting closer and closer to when he was no longer going to be here, he was having nightmares. The book is inferring that the nightmares were tied back to the deal, the pact. And so Paul disappears, Paul dies, Paul's replaced. I say Paul's replaced because I don't want to get into the die, didn't die debate, but he's replaced, although I do believe that he's no longer with us. When that happens, the new guy steps in. Now, does Billy look like Paul? Was he a doppelganger? No. Billy went through a process of transition that had to do with plastic surgery. There was cosmetics. There was the use of latex. He had fillers injected into his face because Billy's face is longer and narrower. And in order to make his face rounder like Paul's, he had fillers. He had his teeth surgically realigned to resemble Paul's teeth. He had certain noticeable moles or whatever marks recreated surgically, dermatologically. A lot of people find this very difficult. First, go back to the latex for a second. People say latex. Well, hey, latex goes back to the Wizard of Oz in the 1930s, okay? So, but by the time they got to Billy, let's just say the mid-1960s, and getting him prepped to step in as the new Paul McCartney, it was 35 years of latex under the belt of people that do latex. And then when we talk about the deep state, we're talking about Tavistock and these types of entities, these types of organizations. God only knows what advancements they have that the public doesn't even know about as far as being able to transform somebody. Billy is not a spitting image of Paul McCartney. If we go back into the 70s when he was with Wings, he was not. On the Sgt. Pepper album, when you look at the Sgt. Pepper album, he's not a mirror image of Paul.
Is there a place I could go to on the website, on the internet, where I could see the original Paul McCartney and the Billy Paul McCartney, so I could pull that up for the audience?
Let me see. That's going to be hard. I don't trust those images. But here we go. Yeah, I'll show you. Can you see this?
Yeah, I can. The Many Faces of Paul McCartney. Whoa, yeah. 1 and 2 are different.
Right. So we have 1. So that's Paul right there. That's Paul.
That's the real Paul McCartney, right?
Circa around 1965 or so. And then this is a double. I was told by a source that there were 3 doubles and lookalikes right out of the gate, along with the biological version of the Beatles. So there were 4 Paul McCartneys, 4 John Lennons, George Harrisons, and Ringo Starrs right out of the chute.
Holy cow. Yeah, they look different. Number 3 looks different.
Yeah, that's Billy with latex and a wig on his head from the Sgt. Pepper era.
And then number 4, who's that?
Well, that's Billy too. So Billy has this longer jaw and he has a higher forehead.
Yeah.
Sometimes he looks a little different because he's had fillers. He had to go in for certain surgeries or whatever. There's also pictures, you'll see them on the internet, where his face looks a little puffy.
Holy cow.
And this is Billy from the Wings era. I mean, this is him with his mullet. Now, take a look at this picture here, Billy with the mullet, and then take a look at the picture here of Paul. They are not the same person.
No.
Okay? So here again, we have Paul again. This is supposedly from Hamburg. This is a hybrid. They doctored a lot of pictures where it's a little bit of Paul, it's a little bit of Billy, and that's to obfuscate, and that's to make it more difficult. Many images have been altered over time.
Who's the first person who noticed that the Pauls look different? Do you know who that was?
There were people in the comment section said that they noticed it right away when the Sgt. Pepper album came out. They looked at, quote, Paul McCartney on the album cover. They said, that's not Paul McCartney. So people picked up on it, but they didn't really have a voice. See, what they did with Sgt. Pepper was they changed the look of all of the Beatles. right? So if you go back to the 62 to 66 period, they had the mop tops and no beards, no mustaches. And then you get to Sergeant Pepper, they got beards and mustaches and they're in these psychedelic outfits. So what they did was, in order to camouflage Billy, they made John look different, George look different, Ringo, they all look different. So a person looking at the album cover is saying, oh, okay, well, geez, this is just a whole different look. And they all look different. So that took the focus off Billy, because if they had just put Billy on the album cover without changing anybody else, there probably would have been a lot more people saying, who is that guy? But here's one, right? This is him from the 1980s.
Holy.
Right here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's weird.
Come on, folks. Does that guy here look like that guy?
No way. When you put it like that, it really shows. Yeah. Wow. I'm glad you're showing this, because, a lot of people think that this is just conspiracy, but
here's his family. Okay. So this is what Stacy has put together. His father was Douglas Hamilton. His mother was Elizabeth Percy. She believes Billy's real name is William Alfred Douglas Hamilton.
And these are Freemasons.
I'm assuming they are Freemasons. Yes. Druids. That's the other thing that Stacy took me through.
Yeah. The guy I know who met Paul McCartney met the Paul McCartney that you see in that photo there.
Yeah, that's Billy. Let me just show you one more thing here before I tell you that story. If you want to know what Billy really looked like before his transformation.
Holy cow.
Okay. So this is him. He played a character called Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band in the 1960s. Okay. Now, this is him, an older him, as Paul McCartney.
Yeah, look at the wandering eye. You're right.
They're the same person. The guy on my right, your left, is just an older version of this guy.
Was the original Paul McCartney a better musician than Billy Shears? Or is Billy Shears the prodigy that he was claimed to be? So we got better replacing the old Paul McCartney.
Yeah, let me show you something here, and I'll answer that question for you. Okay, so here again we have the Stanshall character, and this is the Stanshall character without the mustache. It's very difficult to find him without a mustache. And here is Billy. Now, take a look at Stanshall. He didn't even bother to change the mustache. You could see that the jawline is the same. The nose is the same. I believe he has a hair weave. Some people have said, well, when he was in Let It Be, he kept pushing his hands through his hair. And if you had a hairpiece on or, a wig or whatever, you really couldn't do that. I said, I don't think it's a wig. I think he has a hair weave. When I take people through this, I tell them, notice the overall facial structure, the jawline, the mouth, the mustache, the ear. When you look at the ear, it's going to be hard to see here, but the ear is the same, the way the ear is constructed. Billy's right eye looks straight ahead as his left eye appears lazy and drifts to the left.
Yeah.
And people say, well, how'd they get the eyes to change? Well, it's through a blepharoplasty. So he had a bleph. So we could see here that this eye here, the right eye in both pictures is looking straight ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. The left eye appears to be wandering or drifting, but that's not the case. What's happening is the left eye is doing its normal thing. His right eye has a tendency to lag a little bit whenever he looks left. I've noticed that when he looks hard left, the right eye does not go hard left like his left eye does. Here's another example of it where I broke it down. Here's his right eye, and we can see it's looking straight ahead. His left eye is looking to the left. And then you have the same thing with the Stanshall character. The right eye is looking straight ahead. The left eye is looking slightly left or wandering. Okay, so
man, you've done so much research on this, and yet people still call you crazy. How does that make you feel after spending 8 years? And this is like intense work that you've done, and you're pretty 100% sure, right? That
absolutely that,
and yet you still got people calling you a kook. So how do you deal with that?
The way I deal with it, Victor-Hugo, is I just ignore these people, because I've explained to my audience and my shows and my interviews that when I do this work because I like doing this work. And I've told people in the comment section who say, hey, I try to talk to people about this and they won't listen to me. They laugh at me. They say I'm crazy. I'm a conspiratard. I said, look, the only thing that matters is that you know. The vast majority of people, this is what we were talking about before, they're lost. They're roaming around in the woods aimlessly. So the thing is, it's important that you know. And I am absolutely 100% sure positive that the guy that's playing Paul McCartney today, Billy Shears, is not biological Paul. He is not the original Paul McCartney. Now, let's talk about their playing. When I did my research and I looked into the Rubber Soul album, and I'm not going to be able to go into it here because it's a very, very involved. I concluded during 1962 through the 66 period, their first 7 albums, Please Please Me Through Revolver, they did not write most, if any, of the music. It was written for them.
By the Tavistock Institute, right? The people at the Tavistock?
I believe the way it worked is Theodore Adorno, who was with the Frankfurt School, was a major stakeholder in this psychological operation, this initiative called the Beatles. And I believe that Adorno had a hand in writing some of the music. In fact, the song Piggies from the White Album is right out of Adorno's playbook. So folks, take a listen to Piggies, listen to the lyrics, listen to the music. That's Adorno. George Harrison didn't write that song. And I believe that George Martin also had a big hand in not only arranging the music, but also writing some of the music. Now, aside from Adorno and George Martin, I think what they did was they had a small group of songwriters, professional songwriters, that were dedicated to writing the Beatles music. So a team of maybe 2 or 3 that were writing Paul McCartney style songs, and a team of 2 or 3 that were writing John Lennon styles of songs. So Adorno, the major stakeholder, George Martin, who I refer to as the managing director of the operation, and then a small team of songwriters. George Martin then brought in studio musicians to play the songs. So the songs are recorded using studio musicians. Interestingly enough, there's an interview that goes back to 1976. The interviewer is a guy by the name of Roy Carr, C-A-R-R. And Roy was with New Music Express. I think later on he became the editor of New Music Express, which is a music publication about the music industry. And in 76, he interviewed Phil Spector. And Phil Spector said that he was part of the Beatles operation from the very beginning. Now, why is that important? Now, some people are going to say, oh, Phil was crazy. Yeah, Phil was crazy. But that's not to take away from the fact that he was a brilliant producer. Right? He got himself in all kinds of trouble around 2000 when he shot the actress, Lana Clarkson, I think her name was. But this is 1976 now. So we're right off the heels of him doing a lot of solo producing with George Harrison and John Lennon. And of course, he was involved with the Beatles' Let It Be album. But Phil says, no, my tenure with them goes back to the beginning. And so the interviewer, Roy Carr, is saying, well, really? So Phil says to him, when they landed in the United States in February 7th of 1964, was I not on the plane with them? And so the light bulb goes off on Roy Carr's head. He's like, oh, man, yeah, you were. So Phil said he was with them from the beginning. Now, why is that important? It's important because Phil, his de facto house band, was the Wrecking Crew out of Los Angeles. The Wrecking Crew was behind much of the pop music and the hits of the 1960s and 1970s. The Mamas and the Papas, Tom Jones, Frank Sinatra, Nancy Sinatra, the Monkees, the Beach Boys. They were the go-to studio musicians to get your work done. And that was Phil's de facto band. So if the Beatles can play their instruments, a lot of people will say, Mike is saying the Beatles couldn't play their instruments. Never, ever said that. I said the Beatles could play their instruments, but they weren't up to a skill level that would allow them to do studio recordings. Studio recordings are very efficient. They bring in the very best, boom, 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 click, 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 in and out, bang the songs out. We don't have time to fiddle around with, let's learn this, let's learn that, let's do a little bit of this, let's do a little bit of that. Oh, I made a mistake. Can you rewind the tape? No. You go into the studio, you have studio musicians, you put sheet music in front of them, and you bang it out. People will also say, well, Mike says the Beatles didn't write any of their music. Never said that. I said the Beatles did not write all of their own music. The Beatles did write some of their own music. I don't believe they wrote much, if any, during the 62 to 66 period, but in 67, when Billy took over the band, Billy became the de facto leader of the band in 67 with Pepper. He got John and George, and to some degree Ringo, more involved in the songwriting process and playing on more of the recorded tracks. Was Paul McCartney a better musician than Billy? No, he was not. All of this stuff was already laid out. The songs were already written by ghostwriters, and sheet music was brought in. The Wrecking Crew or musicians from the UK. As an example, I was told by a person who was a very good friend of the late Dan Peake of the band America. America was also produced by George Martin. Very good friend of his. He wrote me and said, Mike, Dan told me that it was Jimmy Page that played the lead guitar on I Saw Her Standing There. And I can go through a number of studio musicians that I believe were played on Beatle records. Members of Cream, not just Eric Clapton on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Bernard Purdie, Andy White, which is admitted to by the official narrative, Ronnie Verrill, another great drummer. I was contacted by a relative of his. Ronnie passed away years ago. A relative contacted me and said that Ronnie, who was actually, he did the drumming on the Muppets, the Muppet Animal who played drums, that was Ronnie. Ronnie was a great drummer, and he played on Beatle records. I was told by another source that Alan White, the great drummer from Yes, who has also passed away, played on Beatle records. I was I was either reading an interview or listening to an interview where somebody from the, it goes back a while, so I don't remember who the person was, said that Phil Spector used to refer to Jim Keltner, another great studio drummer, as Ringo.
Wow.
And there's a story about Quincy Jones. Quincy did an interview going back a number of years ago where he said that the Beatles, and he called out Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr in particular, were no playing MFers. And so that caused a big problem. Damage control went into play right away. They put articles out and said that Quincy didn't mean what he said and everything's cool between Quincy and Paul McCartney and Ringo and all that stuff. Quincy never apologized for saying that. Quincy said that he was sorry for airing out his sentiments in public, but he didn't say, oh, I was wrong. They could play the shit out of anything, right? He never said that. The story he tells in that interview is he was working with Ringo on one of Ringo's solo albums, and Ringo couldn't get one of the drum parts down. He was having a lot of trouble getting a particular drum part down. So Quincy says to Ringo, hey, take a break, go get a beer or something, relax. And I guess Ronnie Verrill, who I just mentioned, was in the studio, or he was nearby. Quincy rings him up and says, hey, could you come down? I need you to help me out with something here on this drum track. So Ronnie comes down, they play the song. Quincy says, this is what we're looking for. Ronnie's like, boom, 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 bangs it out, packs up his sticks, and goes home. And Ringo comes back and says, could you play that back for me? Now, he's unaware that Ronnie Verrill sat in and did the drum track. So Ringo says, and again, this is according to Quincy telling the story. Ringo says, well, that doesn't sound so bad. And so Quincy says to him, that's because it's not you. In July of 1968, Glenn Campbell, who was with the Wrecking Crew, who I suspect also played on Beatle records, along with Big Jim Sullivan out of the UK and Vic Flick out of the UK. Both Big Jim and Vic Flick are dead now. So was Glenn Campbell. He was co-hosting the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour in July of 68. He introduced the band Cream. So you have Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker, and Eric Clapton. And he says that they were these top shelf studio musicians out of the UK. And when Glenn introduces them, he says they've played on records for the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and he goes through a couple of other acts. So here we have Glenn Campbell, who plays for the Wrecking Crew, introducing Cream, who are also studio musicians, and these guys all know each other, and stating that the members of Cream played on Beatle tracks. Now, some people want to argue with me and say, oh, no, he was talking about Eric Clapton playing on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I said, oh, no, he wasn't. I said, because according to the official story, George Harrison didn't ask Eric Clapton to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps until September of 1968. Glenn Campbell introduced Cream in July of 1968. The net of it is the Beatles could play their instruments, but they were not studio-grade musicians. Because of that reason, the way the process worked was, and especially 62 to 66, the songs were written for them. Studio musicians laid down the instrumental tracks. The Beatles came in and did the vocals, just like the Monkees did. Same thing. After 1966, going from 67 to 1970, the Beatles as an entity was still using ghostwriters and studio musicians, but the other Beatles, specifically John, George, and Ringo, were contributing more with their own material and playing on more of their own tracks. I have said to my audience, I've explained to them, if you want to hear the Beatles as a band, a standalone band, listen to the White Album. There were songs on the White Album that they're not playing on and songs they didn't write, but there's a lot of songs there that I believe that they did write and they did play on. Billy was always writing songs. So that's why I exclude Billy from that. Billy was writing songs, I believe, back during the 62 to 66 period, because a number of years ago, he came out and said he wrote the music to the song In My Life, which came out in 1965. Again, the press went into damage control. Holy shit. What's he saying? He can't be saying that stuff. So the papers, online papers, came out and said, oh, we ran a computer model through 2 universities, and that's a John Lennon song, because we're always taught that John Lennon wrote In My Life, words and music. And Paul McCartney misremembered. Here's the thing. You write a song like In My Life, you do not misremember writing that song. I'm sorry, you do not. So I very long-winded. I apologize for that.
I want to share something with you, the audience. For those people who don't believe what you're saying is even a possibility, I don't know if you've seen this, but this speaks to what you just described.
Did you convince Hezbollah to buy this?
Well, obviously, they didn't know that they were buying it from Israel.
Who did they buy it from? Or I think they were buying it from.
We have an incredible array of possibilities of creating foreign companies that have no weight being traced back to Israel, shell companies over shell companies who affect the supply chain to our favor. We create a pretend world. We are a global production company. We write the screenplay. We're the directors. We're the producers. We're the main actors. And the world is our stage.
So what you just described happening back then has now been still not quite perfected now, because we have such false flags that are obvious, everything from October 7th to the World Trade Center to Sandy Hook. I just want people to understand that this has been happening for a very long time. And that's why the research that Michael has been doing is bringing us to the present, where they manufacture these boy bands, they manufacture now the music, because they control at the keyboards even how somebody's voice sounds. I don't have the greatest voice, but if you wanted to dye my hair and have a fashion designer fashion me, and and then artificially intelligence slim me down and everything and arrange my voice, I could be the next biggest pop star. And it's just the reality. People could laugh at that, but that's the truth.
It's a business. They're there to make money, and they got to put a product out. And they're not going to jerk around with subpar talent, skill. I mean, they're going to bring in the very best to create what they need to create to put the product out. And music and the entertainment industry is a huge social engineering tool.
Learning what you've learned, does it diminish the appreciation you have for the brilliance of the Beatles and their music?
The luster with regard to the story behind the Beatles being the creators of the music, that's gone, because that's not the case. They were manufactured. But that being said, regardless of who wrote the music, it's great music, but it's great music with an agenda. This is what I explain to folks. You can have an appreciation for the music. Like I said, I could still throw the White Album on and listen to the songs on the White Album and have an appreciation for the songs. Look, I was a Beatle freak, so the reason why I ended up playing guitar, singing songs, writing songs, and recording was because of the Beatles, at least my understanding of the Beatles at the time. Now, things are going to get even weirder now, because now we're in the world of artificial intelligence. So now we have the situation where music is being created by AI. So you no longer have to rely on the dynamic of humans, bands, studio musicians, songwriters. Eventually what's going to happen is that whole piece of it is going to be stripped out, and artificial intelligence is going to be the primary creator of music, which means that music can do whatever it is that the control system wants it to do, both musically and lyrically, by just typing in prompts. And you don't have to worry about somebody falling off the wagon, walking off the reservation and opening their mouth, like Bob Dylan did back in 2004 with Ed Bradley when he talked about the chief commander.
Yeah, making the deal with the devil. Yeah.
Yeah, and he can't write songs like he used to. He can't do that anymore. Bob had a moment where he walked off the reservation. So they don't have to deal with that anymore because artificial intelligence is going to take care of that. Very sterile. It does whatever we tell it to do. We don't have to convince anybody. We don't have to put anybody in a program. We don't have to threaten anybody. We could just do what we want to do. No resistance.
What's your favorite Beatles album?
My favorite Beatles album, I love Revolver.
Why?
That was it. There was something about Revolver. I thought that I don't know, there was something about it. I really enjoyed psychedelic music. And so Revolver was their segue into the psychedelic movement. It went from Rubber Soul, which was their sixth album, into Sgt. Pepper, which was pure psychedelic. I have an appreciation for Sgt. Pepper, even though I think it hasn't aged very well, because the psychedelic songs in general, I mean, I just think they haven't aged well, although it's still, in my view, a very good album overall. And probably my most favorite album of the Beatles is Abbey Road. And that was the last album that they did with George Martin. They decided to end on a very, very high note, which they did with Abbey Road. It's an extremely well-produced album. But I also believe that the Beatles did not play on all of those tracks, and they did not write all of those songs. So, but there's some songs they played on, but not all of them. I think it was a mixed bag. I like A Hard Day's Night, which was their third album. I think A Hard Day's Night has some really good rock tunes on it. So, I mean, I'm not down on the music per se. I just, the luster behind the official story, the Cinderella story, I call it, the myth. In fact, John Lennon, in an interview he did with Rolling Stone magazine in the early 1970s, called the Beatles a myth, Paul McCartney a myth, and Bob Dylan a myth.
Wow.
Lennon had these moments where he would talk about things. I mean, in one interview, he explained that we had other musicians on our records. We just weren't allowed to talk about it. That was another interview that he did going back many years ago. So the point being is the true story about the Beatles is out there. You just have to read between the lines.
What do you think the significance was of their final song on their final album? And in the end, the love you give is equal to the love you take. Why would they end a Tavistock Institute PSYOP with such a positive message?
I'll give you my perspective on it. It was the end of what they considered the Aquarian conspiracy. Beatles being part of the Aquarian bands where they talked about love, peace, and stuff like that. So I think it was a nod to closing out the era of the counterculture in 1969. It was built upon the human potential movement, which came out of Willis Harman's work, which is also tied back to Tavistock and the Stanford Research Institute. When I talk about the age of Aquarius and making that leap from an age of oppression, the Piscean age, the eon of Osiris to the eon of Horus, and the age of Aquarius, it's important to remember that they're not talking to all of us. It's a message that I believe is intended for the inner circle. Because if they had their druthers, most of us are not going to cross that bridge. Eugenics hasn't gone away. And the whole COVID thing was part of a eugenics program. So it's kind of a mix. It's confusing to a lot of people. What I've explained is that they control both the establishment and the anti-establishment. They control both. And by doing that, they're able to cause controlled conflict. And by creating controlled conflict, they get their order from chaos. So it's very complex. A lot of people want things to be in a little box with a big bow slapped on top of it, and they want it to be very black and white. But there's a lot of dynamics, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of very, very different tactics that they take in order to create a situation where that chaos comes about. The more chaotic things are, the more of a reason it gives them to say, hey, we've got to put a police state in place. We've got to put a control system in place because humanity, people are out of control. Never mind that they created the out of control situation. Going back to 9/11, I just want to mention this. You mentioned BLM. BLM, Black Lives Matter, was also a 9/11 encoded event. BLM has numerology of 9. Black Lives Matter, when it's spelled out, has Pythagorean numerology of 11, 9/11. So did COVID-19 and coronavirus. COVID-19 had Pythagorean numerology of 9, coronavirus 11. It was a 9/11 event. Like I said, the world is run by occultists. And of course, when we get to the 1970s, we get to things like I mentioned before. We get to Kiss. We get to Black Sabbath. We get to Studio 54. We get more into that satanic, hedonistic type of societal thread that a lot of people participated in. It's all done in phases. It's phases. All the genre of music, it's done in phases. Punk rock in the 1970s. Look up the word punk in the dictionary. What does it tell you? A societal outcast. Yet they had an entire genre of music dedicated to a word that meant societal outcasts.
Wow, you're really, because I was born in 1970 in the age of Aquarius. My birthday is February 15th, 1970. And the love you give is equal to the love you take. Such a positive message. And now there's more hatred and discord than ever before is what I'm noticing. So the message didn't ring. And you're right. With the free love that came in through the 60s, then the 70s, that's when, like you said, with the Studio 54, that's when Trump was hanging out with Cohen, who was his mentor. And if you know anything about how sordid Cohen was, it's no surprise that Trump was such close friends with Jeffrey Epstein. And then you have the 80s, which was on a whole nother level. In my opinion, the 80s was some of the best music. I loved the 80s music with the Human League and the New Order and the Psychedelic Furs. To me, that was like fantastic. I was in my teens growing up in New York at that time. And I remember when my first concert ever was at Shea Stadium with REM opening for Joan Jett and the Blackhearts that opened for the Police at Shea Stadium at a sold-out concert. That was the first show that I'd ever seen. I would see concerts, everything from the Grateful Dead to the U2 at the Intrepid to just like major bands, Genesis and all that stuff. Now concerts are completely unaffordable. When I used to go to shows, it was $5, $10, $15. Now it's $1,000 if you want to get in to see a show. So it's a different world. I don't understand how this youth now is able to even go to a concert. Most people just watch stuff on their phones now, which is the Black Mirror. And again, it's total manipulation of the mind. So we're in a very strange place, but it's a natural progression. And again, it goes from what you were saying, what you noticed is the production. We are actors watching other actors leading us through this script, and we're just the background players.
Yeah.
We're being completely manipulated without even realizing it. Like you said, people going crazy over the Beatles, and yet they hired people to scream at the concerts, and then everybody was like, oh, okay, that's what we're supposed to do, so we start screaming too, which of course was to drown out the instruments because they really weren't that great of musicians.
What they did was they decimated true culture. So if you're Italian, you have Italian culture. If you're Irish, you have Irish culture. If you're from Mexico, you have a Mexican culture, and so on. And they handed us pop culture. Pop culture is hot dogs, it's Netflix, it's beer, it's porn. That's what they gave the population. And that's what people are living today. They're living in pop culture. They're living in this fake, engineered, manufactured culture. I call it, it's like a simulation. It's not real. It's like you entered into some kind of video game and you're no longer attached to your true traditions and your true culture.
This has been such a eye-opening experience with you. I'm so glad that we finally connected. It's, like I said at the beginning of the show, taken quite some time for us to get together. I'm so glad that we did finally. And Mike, thank you again so much for sharing time. It's the most valuable gift we have. And I want to remind everybody that united we stand, divided we fall. Never give up, never surrender, keep shining, live, love, flow.
And with me right now is Mr. Mike Williams. How's it going, Mike?
It's going very well, Michael. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you're here. There's so much to discuss with you here. Too much to discuss with you, my friend. And I want to thank you for your time. And for those who don't know, Mike is a musician and independent researcher renowned for his in-depth interviews and investigations into the hidden history of the Beatles, especially the controversial Paul is Dead narrative. And from my recollection, Mike, I believe you started way back in, what was it, 2016, correct?
It was 2016, Michael. Up to that point, I knew about the Paul is Dead conspiracy, but I didn't give it any weight. I just thought it was a marketing gimmick by the Beatles to engage with their fans. So I was a diehard Beatle fan, Beatle freak. And in 2016, I read the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. The book actually came out in 2009, so I got to it in 2016. I was 7 years late to the party. I found it on a lark on Amazon. I started reading it, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. But I stuck with it, and what I looked to do was to check out what the book was saying. So the book would present certain statements in the narrative, and I would go research it. And fully thinking initially that I was going to debunk the stuff that I was finding in the book, but that didn't happen. As I researched, I found that the book was actually quite accurate and truthful.
So you got deeper into it, actually, in other words.
Yeah, I got deep into it. What happened initially was I got the book, I read it, and Sophia Smallstorm is a friend of mine, and at the time Sophia was doing podcasts, and I said to her, hey, I'm reading this book. It's a really crazy book. And I told her it's about the Paul is Dead conspiracy. And I was telling her a little bit about what the book was saying. So she said to me, Mike, why don't you come on my show and talk about the book? I didn't want to do it, Michael. And the reason why I didn't want to do it, first of all, I didn't think it was going to be that big a deal, to be honest with you. And the other thing was I had to put together a massive presentation in order to be able to step the audience through the narrative. The book is 666 pages. There's 66 chapters. And my initial thought was, how am I going to boil this down and then present it within 2 hours, within a 2-hour time frame? Eventually, what happened after I dragged my feet, hoping Sophia would forget, but she doesn't usually forget things, I ended up doing the show with her in September of 2016. And I honestly thought it was going to be the only show I was going to do on the topic. And then in November of 2016, Mark Devlin, who is also a friend, he said, hey, Mike, I heard your show with Sophia. Why don't you come on my show and talk about this? And I said, okay, Mark being a friend and all. So I did it. And during that show, I said to Mark, this is going to be the last show that I'm going to do on this topic because I just didn't want to be the Paul is Dead guy. And I just didn't think, Michael, that the whole thing was going to get legs beyond what I was taking the audience through with regard to the book. So long story short, I was terribly wrong, and I stuck with it. I kept going. I kept looking. It was like an addiction, trying to figure out all the little pieces of the puzzle and to try to connect the dots. And so I did it for 8 years, and I retired it back in November of 2024. And the reason why I ended the research, the ongoing research, the day in and day out stuff, was because after 8 years, I felt, look, I did as much as I could possibly do on this. I took it full circle. I connected a lot of dots, and I just didn't want to get into a position where I'm talking about it for the sake of talking about it.
Right. I imagine you got burnt out, basically.
Oh, yeah. What happens is new people are coming on board. They're going to the channel, and they're asking the basic questions. So what winds up happening is you're reiterating and regurgitating stuff that you've already talked about, stuff you've already presented, which is fine. I can completely understand that. But from a personal perspective, you get to the point where you think to yourself, okay, now it's diminishing returns. Right?
Yes.
So, and then I made the decision. I said, look, the channel is out there. It's always going to be out there. I'm not taking it down. It's going to contain my body of work. And if people want to have their questions answered, what they'll have to wind up doing is hitting the other videos that have the answers to their questions. I'm not going to be able to answer everybody's questions. Some people would send me emails with, could you answer me the following questions? And they would list like 10 to 12 things that they wanted me to answer. And I thought, I can't be doing this all the time. This is occupying too much of my time. And the other thing too with it is that I have a life. I have my wife, I have 2 grandchildren, and my wife and I are retired. And, we have a lot of stuff that we do, and the research was occupying a tremendous amount of time.
I would imagine it's very time consuming. And so you put this in the grave, essentially, the proverbial grave. And I'm thinking perhaps one day you release a book, perhaps.
People have asked me that. They said, Mike, are you going to write a book? I said, well,
just to finally put it to bed, just one book, just leave it all out there. You're done with it. Will that ever happen, Mike?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay.
Yeah. The reason why, Michael, is I've been asked that many, many times. And I said, the thought of it is enticing, but the amount of work that I would have to devote to putting that book together, it's just too much. At this point in time in my life, and with everything else I've got going on, it's just not something that's on my radar. It's funny, Vince Russo asked me the same question. So Vince said, Mike, are you going to write a book? And I told him the same thing I said to you. And Vince has written books. So I said to him, Vince, you know how much work it takes to write a book. If I sat down right now and started writing down everything that I have researched over the past 8 years, that book will be out a decade from now.
That's true. No, you're right.
And I just don't want to bog my life down with that, Michael.
Yeah, more than you already have. You already spent years covering this. And I appreciate that, and I admire your honesty and appreciate that sort of thing, and much respect to Vince Russo out there as well for asking these sort of things, trying to put that idea in your head, but it seems like a lot of other people have already tried.
Yeah, I've been asked many times. People will ask me in the comments section. They will write me emails and ask me if I'm going to write a book. So folks, really, I don't have any intentions of doing that. Like I said, it
ain't happening. It ain't happening.
Yeah, it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah. I don't blame you. It is very time consuming. I've spoken to many people, interviewed a lot of people that author all sorts of material out there. And yes, it takes way too much time, and life is short.
Yeah. And when you do a book like this, you have to have all your citations, which I have, but it's very, very time consuming. Right.
And Mike, I gotta ask you this question. All this time you're putting all this material out there, you're this hardcore fan. Has this diminished sort of the charm of the Beatles that you once had? Has it damaged you in that sense regarding or in regards of you like being a fan, quote unquote fan of the Beatles? Has it hindered you at all?
Well, there was a reality check, Michael.
There we go. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah. So I remember bugging my parents to go see Yellow Submarine in 1968. I was 9 years old.
Oh my.
So I was a little Beatle freak at 9 years old.
Damn.
And
okay.
my father took us to the theater, me and my brother. My brother's 14 months younger than I am. And since that time, I wanted to learn to play guitar. I wanted to play Beatles songs on guitar. Seriously, I was like up to my eyeballs with the Beatles. But since the research, the luster, it's completely gone because they were not supernatural. They were not magical. They were 4 guys that were involved in a psychological operation, a major social engineering initiative that came out of Tavistock, which links back to the Frankfurt School. So once you get that shot of reality and you realize that this is manufactured, this is engineered, like everything else in this reality. It's not real. It's an illusion. I call the Beatles story, the official narrative, it's a fairy tale for adults. That's really what it is. It's no different than a kid believing that a 300-pound guy in a red suit and a white beard can shimmy down a chimney.
Right.
So that's where I'm at with it. Now, I get asked often, well, do you still listen to Beatle music? And I said, yeah, I have a big vinyl collection, and I will still put a Beatles album on once in a while and take a listen. And I can appreciate the craftsmanship of the music. I can appreciate the production of the music, regardless of who wrote it and who recorded it. But like I said, the whole luster, the whole magical piece about what I used to believe about the Beatles is completely gone.
It's tainted.
Oh, very much so. Yeah.
Tainted meat, as they say, yes.
Yeah,
Oh man, I knew you would say that, by the way. I just had a feeling. I've heard a few interviews with you, but I don't think I remember hearing you talk about it that way in this sort of detail.
Well, I get asked once in a while, and what I usually respond with is the luster is completely gone. And so now I'm listening to it as an appreciator of, as I mentioned before, the music, the craftsmanship, the production. When you put Abbey Road on as an example, it's a brilliantly produced album, and the songs are excellent. So I can sit down and listen to that and say, you know what? That's good stuff. But you have to listen to it once you know what I know, listen to it through a different lens and understand that the music had an agenda. Right? That's what the music was all about. It was pushing an agenda. And so once you understand that, then you don't go anywhere with the music other than listen to it.
Right.
You don't join the cult. I was in the cult.
You were in the cult. You drank the Kool-Aid, and it seems like that's a narrative that is very much alive to this day, and it applies to all sorts of different avenues and crooks and crannies, as they say.
Everything. Everything's a cult. Who you worship as a politician is a cult. Your favorite band's a cult. We're surrounded by entertainers and celebrities and all of this stuff, all of this pop music stuff. People jump into buckets and they're part of a cult. They have a certain belief system. They worship, they idolize. It's all around us. It's not just the Beatles. It's not just music.
It's everything really all around us. And you have these different branches of government that get involved. A good example would be like Charles Manson, basically. Right. Who's also, in my opinion, linked to the feds as well.
Yeah, there's people have made some connections going back to Laurel Canyon.
That's right.
And stuff like that, yeah.
Hey, you know what, Mike, gotta be honest. If the Beach Boys would have just listened and played more of his songs, I think Charles Manson might have still be alive today and wouldn't have killed all those people.
Yeah, well then, it's the
That really sent him down the downward spiral there.
Yeah, well then you have the argument that Charles Manson was pretty much a patsy. That there was a whole machine behind him and he was just the veneer. So who knows? I haven't spent a lot of time deep diving into Charles Manson. There's so many different takes, Michael, on different aspects of conspiracy.
Yeah.
You can ask 10 people something about a particular conspiracy and you'll get back 10 different answers.
True. But yeah, you appreciate the music when you listen to it now, in other words. And I know in our first conversation we had together, I brought up Quincy Jones, and he called the Beatles the worst musicians in the world.
Yeah, he called them no playing MFers.
That's right. That too. When you listen to this, do you ever think, well, I wonder who exactly played guitar and played all this music, who really arranged it? Obviously the record labels, but, in terms of musicians, we don't exactly know, do we?
Well, I have an idea.
You have an idea? Okay.
I do. Yeah, I do. The way it was structured, and this is based upon all the research I did into the Rubber Soul album, because the Rubber Soul album is the silver bullet that, in my mind, proves that the Beatles did not write all their own music and they did not play on all of their recorded tracks. If we go to the 1962 through 1966 period, that would be their first album, Please Please Me, through Revolver, and their UK albums. This is for the audience. Those are the Beatles' official album releases. It's not the capital US releases. Just a little point to make there. Between 1962 and 1966, Please Please Me through Revolver, I don't believe they wrote anything. And I don't believe that they played on any of those recordings. And that changed somewhat, starting with the release of Sgt. Pepper through 1970. And I'll get into this in more detail. That's because there was a changing of the guard, if you will, as to who was handling and managing the Beatles. So back during the 62 through 66 period, you had George Martin, who was referred to as the fifth Beatle. And I believe that George was their de facto handler. And when I say handler, I mean he was steering direction. He was making decisions about what songs were going to go on what album and how the Beatles as an entity were going to proceed along the timeline in order to move the social engineering agenda forward. Now, the social engineering agenda, when I talk about that, what I mean is the Beatles were created by Tavistock with linkages back to the Frankfurt School for the purposes of, and I'm going to be very topical on this, maybe we'll get into it in more detail if we have time, but the main premise, mission of the Beatles was to transform the country away from traditional values and traditional religious institutions like Christianity and move it more toward a free love, drug culture, changing essentially the landscape of lifestyles, ethics, morals, those types of things. And the Beatles were very successful in doing that. And that is all part of a Marxist strategy. I mentioned it goes back to the Frankfurt School. And that was done in order to implement cultural Marxism within Western societies. And the United States was a big, big prize for them. Big prize. So anyway, I don't want to get too deep into this right now because I'll derail, but because I want to get back to the musicians and we could talk more about Frankfurt.
The sexual revolution and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sexual revolution, drugs, all of that stuff. So as far as musicians go, so what I had concluded was that the way the system worked or the way the process worked with the Beatles, like many, many, many other bands during that time period, and in fact it still operates this way today, is that the songs were pre-written by ghostwriters. Now when I say ghostwriters, so when I say ghostwriters, what I mean is I believe there was a small group, maybe a half dozen songwriters that came in under George Martin. And George Martin, I believe, was reporting up to Theodore Adorno, who was with the Frankfurt School. And I have concluded that it's likely that Theodore Adorno wrote some of the Beatles' music. He was a composer. George Martin, I believe, also wrote some of the Beatles' music. Now, there's a narrative out there, and it comes from Dr. John Coleman's book on the Committee of 300, which was released in the early part of the 1990s. I think it was around 1992. And in that book, Coleman had said that Theodore Adorno wrote all of the Beatles' music. And again, Adorno was tied back to the Frankfurt School, but the Frankfurt School and Tavistock are connected at the hip. For one guy to write all of that music, I thought to myself, I don't know about that. When I did my big presentation back in April of 2020, which is titled, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music?, I dove into Theodore Adorno. And with everything else that Adorno had going on with the Frankfurt School, his books, his interviews, I didn't think it was possible. It didn't seem reasonable to me that he would be sitting down writing all of their original compositions. Now,
right. You know, I had a hard time as well. I'm sorry to interrupt you like this, but I always have a hard time believing that artists themselves wrote a lot of this music. Lennon, McCarthy, you know, they claim that they primarily wrote all the songs. And, you know, I've always thought, are you sure about that? I've always been extremely curious and skeptical about that part, especially nowadays. All these artists that people like, it's like none of them even wrote their own music.
And when their names do wind up on the credits, now it's possible, obviously, we're not going to discount that some artists can write their own music. But also what goes on in the music industry is if somebody contributes a couple of lyrics or maybe makes a suggestion or a recommendation on a couple of chords, they could end up getting song credit for writing that song. Now, did they really write the song? No, they didn't really write the song. And with artists, the reason why that's done, it's to promote them. It's to build them up, to make them look like they're these great songwriters, musicians, and so on. So it's kind of a pumping up of the tires approach to get the public to become more engaged and more in awe of these artists and these bands.
Yeah.
Right? So I think what happened was Adorno was the primary major stakeholder in the Beatles project, and I'll call it a project. It was a psychological operation. Underneath him was George Martin, who I refer to as the managing director of the project. So George was responsible for all of the operational stuff that was going on, making sure the songs got written, making sure the songs got recorded, getting the Beatles in the studio to sing the vocals. And I believe George was also writing some of the tunes. But underneath George Martin, I think there were maybe a half a dozen songwriters, like I mentioned before, that were on the Tavistock/EMI staff that were dedicated to writing the Beatles music. So you might have 2 or 3 songwriters that were focused on Paul McCartney style songs. Another 2 or 3 that were responsible for writing John Lennon style songs. So that's how the songs got written. And once the songs were written, George Martin would bring in the studio musicians, because that's what he worked with. He worked with studio musicians. And you would put the sheet music down in front of the studio musicians in the studio, and you would click the record button, and these guys and gals would go to town. And they would they would bang out these songs. Now, who are some of these musicians? So let me just take you through a couple. You may not know some of the names, but I'm sure the folks listening to the show, especially if they're around my age, will, because some of these names will ring a bell. The official narrative admits that Andy White played on 2 of the Beatles songs going back to 1962. I think it was P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do. And George Martin had hired him to play drums. So Ringo, when they released the singles back in 1962, Ringo wasn't on those tracks. That was Andy White. And the official narrative admits that. Now, I don't believe that George Martin hired Andy White just to play on 2 songs. I think Andy White was hired to play on, in all likelihood, I would say it's likely that he played on many of the songs on their first album out of the UK, Please Please Me. So we have Andy White. So if we fast forward to 1978, Bernard Purdie. Bernard is, he's an American. He is considered one of the premier studio musicians. He's in the Drummers Hall of Fame. In 1978, in an interview, I think it was Gig magazine, he said that he drummed on 21 Beatles songs on the early albums.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
I'm familiar with them, yes.
Okay. And of course, when he was being interviewed, the interviewer was saying, well, what songs? And Bernard said, well, I'm not going to tell you what songs. And the reason why Bernard didn't do that was because he was looking for more money from the Beatles enterprise. And if he just spilled the beans about what songs, he felt that he was taking leverage away from himself. So that's why he never came out with the songs. Because people will ask me, well, they'll say, Bernard never named the song, so he's lying. He's lying. He's not lying. I mean, look at the guy's resume. He was Aretha Franklin's drummer for 25 years. He's played with Steely Dan. He's played with the Rolling Stones. I mean, the list of people that he's played for on recordings goes on.
He doesn't have to lie.
No, he doesn't have to lie, right?
Yeah, he doesn't got to, no.
So anyway, so Bernard Purdie drummed on 21 early Beatles songs. Now, when he says the early albums, he's referring to Please Please Me, With the Beatles, and A Hard Day's Night. I think in one interview he mentioned the first 3 albums. And the way it was done was the tapes were sent to him over in New York, and he actually did the drum tracks in, at the time, Capitol had a studio, their recording studio. It's not there anymore. It's long gone. But back in the day, that's where he did the overdubs. He also took us all through it in an interview in 2004. It was a Red Bull interview, and he explained exactly how it worked and why it works that way. It's called fixing a record. And he said it goes on all the time. And he said, look, I was just doing a job. I was asked to come in and fix the drumming on these songs, put down a good drum track. And that's what he did. So we have Andy White and Bernard Purdie. Then I was contacted after April of 2020, when I released my big presentation on whether they wrote all their music, by a relative of the great session drummer out of the UK, Ronnie Verrill. Now, Ronnie's been dead a long time, but his relative told me that Ronnie drummed on Beatles songs as well. And what she said to me was, Mike, now that the cat is out of the bag, let me just tell you, Ronnie drummed on Beatles songs as well.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then is something else that's very interesting. In an interview that goes back to 1976, the interviewer was a guy by the name of Roy Carr, C-A-R-R. And Roy later on became the editor of New Music Express, which is a music industry magazine. I don't know if it's still around anymore. It was big in its day. And he was interviewing Phil Spector. Phil, of course, was considered to be a brilliant producer. Crazy? Absolutely. But he was a brilliant producer. So in 1976, Roy Carr's having this interview with him, and Roy starts asking him questions, and Phil Spector says that he had been working with the Beatles since inception. So Roy Carr, he's never heard this story before. In fact, most people haven't heard this story before. They think of Phil Spector as the producer that put out the Let It Be album. But in that interview, Phil Spector says, no, I was with them since day one, and I was working with them and making them who they are. So he says to Roy Carr, when they landed in America on February 7th of 1964, was I not on the plane with them? And so the interviewer, Roy Carr, is, he's pausing and he's thinking, yes, you were. And so Phil was like, there you go. So Phil says he was involved in all of the albums going back from the beginning. I think he rattled off Rubber Soul, Sgt. Pepper. So what does that mean? Phil Spector's de facto house band was the Wrecking Crew out of L.A. Now, the Wrecking Crew, they were responsible for the musicianship and the instrumentation on many, 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 many pop songs in the 1960s and the 1970s. The Wrecking Crew worked with the Beach Boys. They worked with Frank Sinatra, Tom Jones, Nancy Sinatra, and the list goes on and on and on.
Hitters, yeah.
They were the go-to studio musicians when you were going to go put an album out. So what Phil is telling us in so many words is that the Wrecking Crew, in all likelihood, based upon that interview with Roy Carr, they were the musicians on some of those Beatle tracks. I'm not going to say all of them because there were studio musicians out in the UK as well, just like the Wrecking Crew that, and I'll give you some of those names too. The other thing is that Phil Spector used to refer to the studio drummer Jim Keltner, and Jim Keltner has done a lot of playing with Ringo Starr, George Harrison. He used to refer to him as Ringo. What we can draw from that, if we want to start connecting dots, is that Jim Keltner was likely another drummer on Beatles songs.
Yeah.
So, right? So now we've got Andy White, Bernard Purdie, Ronnie Verrill, Jim Keltner, and if the Wrecking Crew was involved on recording some of the Beatles' music, in all likelihood, we could probably throw Hal Blaine into the equation as well, because Hal was the famous drummer from the Wrecking Crew. Then we have an interview, not an interview, but it was Glenn Campbell was introducing, I should say, Cream on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. So Glenn was the guest host that night. So Cream was going to play. Glenn got up on stage, and this is July of 1968. And Glenn Campbell, by the way, played for the Wrecking Crew. It's likely that Glenn is also on Beatle tracks. But when he introduced Cream, which would be Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Jack Bruce, the bass player, he said that they were cream of the crop studio musicians out of the UK. And then Glenn goes on to say that they have played on Beatle records, the Rolling Stones, and he rattles off a couple of other bands. Very eye-opening. I don't know how many people caught it, but Glenn Campbell said on national TV that the members of Cream, being studio musicians, played on Beatle records.
Wow.
Now, some people will argue with me and say, well, that he means that Eric Clapton played lead guitar on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And I said, no, that's not what he's saying. George Harrison didn't ask Eric Clapton to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps until September of 1968. Glenn introduced Cream in July of 1968. So Glenn was referring to each member of Cream playing on Beatle records. I know a guy that was a very, very close friend to Dan Peake. Now, Dan Peake is one of the founding members of the band America. And America was produced by George Martin. This person wrote me, and we have a correspondence every once in a while. And he said to me, Mike, I knew Dan very, very well. And he said to me, I remember him telling me that Jimmy Page played the lead guitar on I Saw Her Standing There, which is a song that's off the Beatles' first UK album, Please Please Me. Other candidates to have played on Beatle records, one is Vic Flick. So Vic Flick was the great studio guitarist out of the UK, out of England. And he is the person that played the James Bond sounding theme at the beginning of the Help track on the Help album in America. They don't have that same intro on the UK A Hard Day's Night album. But in the United States, when it was released, they had that James Bond sounding riff. That was Vic Flick. So Vic also played the guitar he did the guitar work on the song Ringo's theme for the soundtrack. Now, my thinking is, okay, look, if you're going to bring Vic Flick in, are you going to bring him in just to play those two things, those two parts? Or are you going to bring a guy like Vic Flick in to actually sit in and record a number of songs? The other thing is, get a load of this one, Michael. Vic Flick played for the George Martin Orchestra. Okay? So it's not like they didn't know who he was. If he played the George Martin Orchestra, then George Martin clearly knew who he was, and I'm sure they brought him in. Also, another candidate to have played on Beatles songs is Big Jim Sullivan. So Big Jim, out of the UK as well, he was a very sought-after studio player, and he was also a very adept sitar player. I'm thinking that it was Big Jim that was playing both recording the guitar work on Norwegian Wood and also the sitar work. The story goes that George Harrison, who we're told was learning the sitar, used to visit Big Jim Sullivan. So if he's going to visit Big Jim Sullivan, I'm thinking he was probably getting lessons from a guy that had mastered the instrument. But it's not George Harrison on Norwegian Wood. It's just not. It's got to be a guy like Big Jim Sullivan. I was also told by another source that another drummer that drummed on Beatles songs was Alan White. Now, Andy White is the drummer I spoke about earlier. Alan White is the drummer that used to play for Yes, the band Yes. And he also, I'm told, played on Beatle recordings. So those are some of the names that I have. I'm trying to think if there's any more. In an interview that John Lennon did, I think it was probably back in the 1970s. I watched it a long time ago. John had said that they had other musicians playing on their songs, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. Yeah, so in any case, I'm just taking the audience through this because those are some names. People always ask me, who do you think was on those albums? It's possible Eric Clapton was also playing on other Beatle songs other than While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I think Jimmy Page played on more than just I Saw Her Standing There. I think Vic Flick was on a lot of the songs. Big Jim Sullivan was on a lot of the songs. In the Red Bull interview in 2004 with Bernard Purdy, Bernard said that there were 4 drummers on the Beatles' early music, and he's talking about the period between 1962 and 1966, and he said, this is a direct quote, Ringo was not one of them. He said Ringo's job was to play live. Studio work, no. And
yeah, I believe all of this, by the way, because again, going back to, modern times, you look at an album and there's all kinds of people getting accredited for their work in the studio.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that it's no different than it was back in the day.
No. And the thing is, the Beatles recording sessions were sequestered. So there was a very, very limited number of people that were allowed to be in those recording sessions. It was pretty much closed door. And you have to ask yourself, well, on one hand, I could understand not having a crowd in there. But on the other hand, it also seems like it was a way in order to keep the story from leaking out, keeping the truth from leaking out.
Right. And hearing all this, I mean, I feel like Quincy Jones was right about them being the worst musicians in the world. And I feel like now, knowing what I know now hearing you talk about this, I feel like he's been vindicated here.
Well, what he was saying was that the Beatles were not studio players. That's what he was saying. Quincy being a big-time producer like George Martin. In fact, there's an interview with George Martin that Billy's the guy that's playing Paul McCartney, Billy Shears. It goes back to a documentary about George Martin. It's called Produced by George Martin. And Billy's sitting down with George, and Billy's saying, well, you were used to working with studio musicians. And they were having a conversation around Ringo. And so George Martin goes, yeah, that's what I work with, studio musicians. And then Billy goes on to say that Ringo had a tendency to speed up. In other words, his ability to stay in the pocket and keep time wasn't great.
Right. Yeah, again, and Jones also says that about Ringo Starr, saying that he remembers once we were in the studio with George Martin, Ringo had taken 3 hours for a 4-bar thing he was trying to fix on a song. And that's when he said he couldn't get it. He said to go get some shepherd's pie in a sarcastic tone.
Right.
I believe he said something like that in a in an interview with, who was it, the New Yorker, I believe it was.
That's right. He told Ringo to take a break because Ringo could not get the drum part down. And so Quincy said, go get some shepherd's pie and a beer and take a break. And what happened was he got a hold of Ronnie Verrill. Ronnie, I talked about, his relative said that Ronnie played on Beatles tracks.
Right.
And Ronnie came in. And again, folks, this information is readily available. Just look up Quincy Jones and the Beatles were no playing MFers. It'll pop up.
People were trying to say at the time, Quincy Jones is talking out of his backside. He doesn't know what he's talking about. It seems like he was right all along.
So when he came out with that story, what happened was the news and the Beatles enterprise went into damage control. You can't be saying that stuff, Quincy.
Yeah.
So then there were articles that came out afterwards and said that he had apologized. But the thing is, Quincy did not apologize for saying that the Beatles, and specifically he talked about Ringo and Paul McCartney. And he wasn't talking about Billy, because Billy's an accomplished musician. He was talking about the original Paul. When he apologized for airing his sentiments out in public. He never came back and said, oh, I'm really sorry for what I said because you know what? They can play. I was talking out of turn. I shouldn't have said that. That's not what he said. He said, I should not have said anything. My daughters got upset with me. I'm paraphrasing here because I aired out dirty laundry. It's interesting. There was an article also by another interview that was done in New Music Express with the Beatles' original sound engineer, Norman Smith. I think it was dated 1971. So this is only 9 years after the Beatles got going with EMI and recording. And during that interview, Norman Smith said that he wasn't impressed with them, that they had a very difficult time getting Love Me Do down. And I'm going by memory here. I believe he said that they failed in the studio. And this is Norman Smith. This was their sound engineer. So the point being is, Michael, that there's a lot of information out there. You have to find this stuff. It's there. And when you find it, you start to put the pieces together, and it tells an entirely different story about the Beatles. It's 180 degrees opposite of what we're told from a Beatles official narrative, the Cinderella story.
Right. It's not so organic after all.
No, it's not organic. We have to understand that the music business is a business, and they're putting a product out.
Right.
And to put that product out, they have to do it as cost effectively and as efficiently as they possibly can. So they're not going to, when I say the producers and the record label, not going to spend any time at all working with people that are going to cost them money. In other words, they're not up to the skill level of a studio musician.
Right. And for those who don't know, going into a studio costs a lot of money, by the way.
Yeah. And some people want to argue, oh, the Beatles had free studio time. There's no such thing as free studio time.
That doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. You still have to pay people to be there.
Right.
You have to keep the lights on. You have to have sound engineers, sound techs. You have to pay the producer, Yeah,
there's a lot of people got to get their cut.
Yeah.
In other words, folks, it's not just you go in the studio and you have all this time. It doesn't work that way.
No. And with Rubber Soul, what happened was, the story goes that the Beatles came into the Rubber Soul sessions and they banged out 16 songs, and they came in with virtually no backlog of music. So that's what piqued my interest, because I was watching a DVD. It's Deconstructing the Beatles, and Scott Fryman is the author of the DVD series. And Scott does a great job. He tells the official narrative, but Scott's an accomplished composer himself, and he does a great job of presenting the story. But as a musician myself, and as a songwriter, I got 15 or 20 minutes into that DVD when he got to the point where he said they came in essentially empty. They had no songs written, and they had to get 16 done in 30 days, 14 for the album and 2 for a single. I said, that didn't happen. Did not happen, because
that's kind of hard to do.
It's impossible to do. You have to write the music. You then have to learn the music. When I say learn, let's say Paul writes a song or John writes a song. Then he's got to take it to the other band members and teach them. And then once you are taught the song, then you go through rehearsals. And as you're going through the rehearsal, you're going to make changes to the songs, because you've got to think, okay, I thought that was going to work, but it's not working. It's
it
not,
doesn't sound that good.
it doesn't sound right, so we have to do something different. And
so it does take a lot of time to arrange music is essentially what Mike is saying here, folks.
Yes,
and that's 100% true. If you ever played in a band, and I have, I know exactly how and what goes on. And doing something to that extent, producing in any kind of album, even an EP for that matter, off the top of your head, is pretty impossible.
I'm glad I'm talking to somebody that has that experience. You also have to write the lyrics. And sometimes lyrics will come quickly. Other times lyrics do not come quickly. So
and we're talking about the Beatles here, by the way, folks.
Right. You've got two work streams. You've got the music piece of it, and you have the lyric piece of it. And then you've got to bring them together. And the way it works is sometimes the music comes first. Other times you have the lyrics.
Right.
So there's this give and take, and there's this dynamic. So when you think about coming into the studio with no music, and you're going to start writing the songs when you arrive, and you've got to finish everything up in 30 days, which means write, learn, rehearse, arrange, record, and mix 16 songs, that's not happening. I'm sorry.
It's not. And by the way, you also forget the fact that when you are in a band, let's say the drummer doesn't like a riff, or the guitar player doesn't like a drum fill that you did. I mean, it goes on and on. So to do that in such a little time, that sounds impossible to me right away, by the way.
It's really not possible. And especially, there was an interview that John and Paul did back on August 5th of 1966. It was the same day that they released Revolver. That's the album after Rubber Soul. And during that interview, it's a BBC interview, the BBC interviewer is asking them, various questions about songwriting and all this stuff. And John and Paul said, well, with the last album, and he's talking about Revolver because that's the album that was just released on that day. He said it took us weeks to write just one song. Weeks. So I'm listening to this interview, and I actually have put this interview, I slipped it into different presentations to get the point across. If it took you weeks to write one song for Revolver, then how did you write 16 songs in 30 days? That's 4 weeks. How did you do that?
The math ain't adding up. It ain't adding up.
The math is not adding up. And I have people who want to argue with me and say, oh, no, they came in with some songs. Well, in Mark Lewison's book, one of his books, I have it behind me. I have two of his books. He said that the Beatles had to write more than a dozen songs in a 30-day period of time. So for all the people that want to push back, I said, okay, let's go with Mark Lewison's explanation. Mark is considered the Beatles historian. And Mark is telling us that they had to write 13 or more songs when they went into the Rubber Soul sessions. So I said, let's just go with that. Let's just go with 13 songs. So the Beatles arrive at EMI Studios on October 11th of 1965. Again, they don't have any songs. So the official narrative says they had partial drafts of Michelle, We Can Work It Out, What Goes On. The official narrative will say, well, they brought What Goes On from an earlier time. I think it goes back to 1962 or something. They brought it into the Rubber Soul sessions. But what they don't tell you, unless you dig deep, is that the entire song was revamped. So in other words, it was completely rewritten. Essentially what they did was they tossed the old version of the song and they had to rewrite it, keeping the chorus and trashing everything else. So what happened was they arrive on October 11th. On October 12th, Michael, the song Run for Your Life is done. So you show up on the 11th, and then on the very next day, you've got the first song in the bag. Then on October 13th, 2 days after they arrive, Drive My Car is done. Day Tripper on the 16th, 5 days in. If I Needed Someone, 7 days in. Then we have Norwegian Wood, 10 days in. In My Life and Nowhere Man are completed on the same day, on October 22nd. And then We Can Work It Out on October 29th. So in October alone, 8 songs were recorded in 18 days with a total of 28 takes for all songs, which is an average of 3.5 takes per song. So the thing with Rubber Soul that they tell us is that not one song exceeded 5 takes. You didn't come in with anything. You had to write, learn, rehearse, record, And not one song took more than 5 takes. And then we have the same type of thing happening in November. In fact, in November, it gets even weirder because on November 11th, we're told that the Beatles completed 4 songs on the very last day. They were recording Rubber Soul between October 11th and November 11th of 1965. So on the very last day, in a very long session, I think it was like 12 or 13 hours, they banged out You Won't See Me and Girl, 2 songs that didn't exist before that day. They finished off Wait, which they pulled in from the Help recording sessions from earlier in the year, in the spring. And they did I'm Looking Through You. So the question we have to ask ourselves is that even remotely realistic?
Sounds like a stretch.
It's a huge stretch. So in November, they did 8 songs. They were recorded in 13 days, which was 5 days less than October, with a total of 14 takes, half the number of takes, which averages 1.8 or 2 takes per song. It's ludicrous. This is the type of thing that I was taking a look at and I was analyzing it. And I had to dot my I's, cross my T's. I had to double check. I had multiple sources to make sure that the dates were right, that the number of takes was correct, because you don't want to make a fool out of yourself when you're doing this work.
Right.
So that's why Rubber Soul is what I refer to as the silver bullet. It's the silver bullet that says that the Beatles did not write all their own music and did not play on all of their recorded tracks. Also in that August 5th, 1966 interview, Paul said that we're limited as a group and we're the first to say we're not all that good musically. He said the same thing 2 months earlier at the Japan Hilton, where he said that they never claimed to be great musicians. Now, here's the problem with that statement. This is coming from the horse's mouth. This is coming from Biological Paul. In order for you to pull off the schedule I just took everybody through, getting all those songs done in October and November, from October 11th through November 11th, you have to be really good musically, very skilled at your instrument.
Yeah, you can't half-ass it, in other words.
Right. Because you're banging this stuff out. So what happened was, this is what happened with Rubber Soul. I'll just cut to the chase. All of the songs were pre-written. All of the songs were pre-recorded instrumentally. So George Martin had the songs written, brought in the studio guys and gals, banged out the music, and then when the Beatles showed up in the studio on October 11th, their job was to sing the vocals.
There you go, yes.
They had to learn the vocals. So I'm sure what happened was when the tracks came in, there was a guide vocal so that they could learn the melody.
Yeah, the melody, the chorus.
Harmonies,
right.
Right. That's what their job was for 30 days. That's what they had to do for 16
That
songs.
sounds more believable, more logical, in my opinion.
That's definitely what happened. And that's the model, Michael, that was being used from day one. So that's just not Rubber Soul. So if we go back to Please Please Me all the way through Revolver, here's something, a little tidbit of information about Revolver. So Revolver was their 7th album. And right after they released Revolver, they went on tour. And their set lists did not include one song off their newly released Revolver album. Not one.
Not one, huh?
Not one. Why was that? The reason for that is because they hadn't learned the songs. They weren't taught how to play the songs. So,
well, that makes sense too, right there, yeah.
Right. When the Beatles went on tour, and their set lists were usually 30 minutes and around 11 songs. And many times 2 of those 11 songs were covers. So the Beatles spent time at EMI Studios being tutored on how to play these songs. And then they would rehearse those songs. And those are the songs that they took out on the road. There's also an article that came out. Let me see if I could find it real quick. It was in an official Beatles magazine that was out during the day. I think it was Beatles Monthly or something like that. And so Paul McCartney was asked the question, we're talking about Biological Paul, what do they have in the hopper for songs going into their next recording session? And they were referring to Rubber Soul. And Paul said, we don't have anything. The cupboard's bare. So here we have it again from the horse's mouth, from Paul McCartney, saying that, we're going into the studio and we don't have anything really written. So we're going to go in cold. Now, the other problem with this coming into Rubber Soul with no music is we're told that with all of the touring and all of the publicity and everything else the Beatles were doing, going back, starting in late 1962, up through when they had to show up in the studio to do Rubber Soul on October 11th, apparently, according to the official narrative, they always found time to write music. We're told that they allegedly wrote 8 songs, original songs for their first album, Please Please Me, 8 songs for their second album with the Beatles, all 13 songs for A Hard Day's Night, even though the recordings sessions for A Hard Day's Night overlapped with the timeline for the making of the movie. So, go figure that. 8 more songs for their next album, which was Beatles for Sale. And then we get into Help, and they were able to bang out 12 original songs. So the official narrative is telling us that they found time to do this, even though their schedule was extremely hectic, and it was very, very hectic. They still found time, John and Paul, because they were prolific, genius songwriters, to get these songs written for these albums. Well, the question then becomes, what happened after their 5th album, Help? Did they just stop writing songs? Did they not know that they had a record that they had to record later in the year in 1965? Because in 65, the first album in 65 that they put out was Help. The second one was Rubber Soul. The Beatles were on the hook for 2 albums a year. And that's a lot of work. That's a lot of sitting down and doing songwriting and banging through music and lyrics and putting your heads together and pulling songs together.
Indeed.
So they were on the hook for that. The point I'm making to the audience is Rubber Soul was not a surprise. In other words, they knew they had a second album they had to do later in the year after Help. Did everybody just nod off and fall asleep and just forget about writing songs for the upcoming album? Brian Epstein never reached out to the band that he was managing and said, "Hey lads, how are we doing? How are you coming along with those songs? George Martin says we need 16, 14 for the album and 2 for a single. So I hope you guys are heads down doing this." And then we're to believe that George Martin himself, the producer, didn't contact Brian Epstein or didn't reach out to the Beatles themselves and ask, how are we coming along with the songs?
Right.
That's an enigma. Now, the other thing, too, is no producer, no record label, no producer is going to be on a hook to get an album out and not have any songs written when the band enters the studio. Because what will happen when the band cannot write 16 songs? What's going to happen? EMI is going to what? They're going to say, "Oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
Right.
But we'll catch you, the next time." No. I mean, there would be hell to catch for not getting that album out because the Beatles were a huge cash flow to EMI, and Rubber Soul was positioned for the Christmas season. And that record had to be in retail by December 3rd of 1965 in order for EMI to really capitalize on the Christmas buying season.
Right. There are certain deadlines you must meet.
Right. There's absolutely no way, when you put your thinking cap on, you think logically, there is no way George Martin or EMI was going to accept that the Beatles were going to come in with virtually no material and then throw a Hail Mary and pray to God that they were going to pull it off.
And they have a hit, in other words, too.
Right, right. And the thing, too, is when you take a look at Rubber Soul, there's really no filler. We're talking about some really good songs. I mean, you might say that some of the songs like Run for Your Life is not the best thing they've ever put out, but
right.
There's other great songs on there like Drive My Car, Day Tripper, If I Needed Someone, Norwegian Wood, In My Life, Nowhere Man, We Can Work It Out, Michelle. I mean,
I have a hard time believing Day Tripper took like an hour to make.
Right. It's absolutely just a ridiculous story. And so what happens is when you see the little thread and when you start pulling at it, the sweater comes apart, the sleeves fall off.
True.
And it's interesting, since I've done this,
wow,
I've never had anybody who means anything write me and say, "Here's how it was done."
You face no pushback then in terms of the technical aspects of the writing and all that sort of jazz.
No. What I get is I get avoidance. They don't even bring it up. They don't go there. Of course,
They don't say, "Oh, Mike." They don't say, "Oh, Mike, you're just jealous." They're better writers than you, better musicians than you.
Oh,
Mike, all this time you're just jealous.
I'll get that from the people who don't matter. In other words, if somebody,
Right, I mean,
if somebody's a layperson, they're not a songwriter, they're not a musician, they've never been in a recording studio, if they've never done any of that work, they will throw those types of statements out there. Nonsense.
Those are just the marks. Yes.
Yes, those are the marks. But people within the industry, no, they know, they zip up. Although, like I said, there are people that are in the industry that reached out to me and said, "You're right."
It's another question I was going to briefly ask you, by the way. I was curious if anybody from the biz have reached out to you and have basically vindicated some of your thoughts and opinions and some of your work, in other words.
Yes, I can't give their names out because
as I know, you can do that.
The reason why is because to talk about this and you're in the business, you run the risk of being blackballed. This is sacred territory. Some of these folks have become friends of mine. One is a sound engineer out of Europe. He's worked with some big bands. He's helped me a lot to understand a lot of how this works behind the scenes. One person is very accomplished in the music industry and has been in the industry for a long time.
Who, Rick Rubin?
Not Rick. There is an interesting story about Rick Rubin, though, in that.
Oh, really?
Well, in that Hulu special, McCartney 321.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if people have watched that, but if you hadn't, watch this piece of it at least. So what happens is, Rick's interviewing Billy, Paul McCartney.
Right. I remember now.
Right, and he brings up the tracks for While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And so Rick isolates the bass track. And he's playing it back, and as Billy's listening to it, Billy seems to be as much in awe of the bass sound and the tone and the aggressiveness as Rick. And I'm watching this, I'm thinking to myself, this is very interesting. Billy didn't add anything to the conversation, things like, "Hey Rick, you know how I got that sound? I played through this amp. This is the bass I played. I played a Rickenbacker, I played whatever, I played a Fender."
Yeah.
No information like that, Michael. None.
Really?
No. He was just kind of going along with Rick, playing along, and it was obvious to me Billy did not play the bass on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, because if he had, he would have had all kinds of information that he would have sprinkled onto the conversation with Rick Rubin in order to explain how it came about.
You're right about that, because if you do something of that magnitude, small little details of what you were doing.
Of course.
What your finger was in this position, actually, but you played it this way instead. You would know these sort of things.
Yes, and if somebody said to me, "Mike, how did you get that guitar sound on your song, the tone, what amp did you play through? How did you get that sound?" I would say, "Okay, This is what I did." I found that to be very interesting. That's
telling. No, you're right.
It is very telling. So who do I think played bass on While My Guitar Gently Weeps? I think it was Jack Bruce from Cream, because remember, Eric Clapton from Cream played the lead guitar. So I'm thinking maybe it was Jack Bruce that came in and laid down the bass track for While My Guitar Gently Weeps, because Billy added absolutely no insights. Zero.
Right, yeah. That's a dead giveaway in my opinion.
The article I was talking about was the Beatles book before. I said the Beatles magazine. Here's another interesting blurb out of that book. It's dated October of 65, so it was right before the Beatles went in for Rubber Soul. So it talks about Brian Epstein's plan to film the Beatles' performance at Shea Stadium in America. Then it goes on to say that some of the sounds were not quite right, and the boys have to dub their voices in bits where the screaming prevented the vocal from being recorded. Let me explain why that's important. What this official magazine, the Beatles book, is telling us is that the version of the Beatles Shea Stadium performance that you listen to on YouTube was edited and enhanced post-production. So what this is telling us is the vocals were redone in the studio after the fact. It's also telling us that if they had to redo the vocals because of bleed from the audience and the screaming, that means anything else that was being mic'd, like the guitar amps, the bass amp, and the drums, also had to have had the same exact problem.
Right.
That would mean that not only were the vocals redone after the fact, but also the music.
Yeah, everything was overdubbed.
Everything was overdubbed.
Damn.
In the studio after the fact, and then what they did was they synced up the performance with the new recordings, and that's what they released. And
that's a 1-2 punch right there.
Yeah, it's very clear what happened there, and the use of backing tracks. In fact, I had a listener of mine analyze 2 backing tracks from the Beatles' 1966 performance. I think it was Candlestick Park and Dodger Stadium. And Michael, I forgot which song it was, a song or two. They were exact replicas. In other words, there was no difference in the performance, none whatsoever, which means they had a backing track, a pre-recorded track, and that's what they laid in. That's what they put in, inserted as part of the performance. And the use of backing tracks, by the way, is very, very common. I mean, this has come out a lot now.
It's still going on to this very day.
Yep, it's coming out a lot now. Even the use of vocals are being reused where there's miming on stage. The singer is miming. Phil from the YouTube channel Wings of Pegasus does an awful lot of work on this, does some great work on it, and he has shown where so many performances they're using pre-recorded vocal tracks over and over and over again. And there's actual miming taking place on stage. In fact, a big surprise was when it came out that Don Henley was doing it from the Eagles.
And by the way, we didn't really even gloss over the fact that some of these songs, it seems like there was some influencing or borrowing of other artists out there during that time as well. Which is what you get from a lot of bands out there, including Metallica, for instance, another good example, much more modern example of these people stealing riffs from other smaller bands, lesser known.
Yeah, there's a lot of what they call borrowing. Let me just take a look here. I think I have something here on some of the songs that the Beatles borrowed. Bear with me one second, folks. Okay. So this was an article in
Rolling... Mike, if you only had produced if you had produced a book, Mike, it wouldn't take you this long to find it.
I know. 5 songs the Beatles ripped off. This is from Rolling Stone magazine. Goes back a ways. So the beginning of Revolution comes from Pee Wee Creighton's Do Unto Others. Come Together was borrowed or pinched from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me. Lennon was sued in 1973 by Chuck Berry's publisher because Come Together borrows from Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me. I Feel Fine was borrowed from Bobby Parker's Watch Your Step. I Saw Her Standing There was from Chuck Berry's I'm Talking About You. The bass line is identical. And Lady Madonna was from Humphrey Littleton's Bad Penny Blues.
Yeah, George Harrison. Also, his song, My Sweet Lord.
Yeah, he ripped off the Chiffons, He's So Fine. I mean, and he ripped it off. It's funny, John Lennon was asked about it in the Playboy interview in 1980. You know, what do you think about George Harrison and the lawsuit because My Sweet Lord was plagiarizing He's So Fine? And I'll never forget this. I'll paraphrase this now because it's been a long time, but John said he knew better.
He knew better, yeah.
He knew better. So, that was John's way of saying, yeah, he knew he ripped it off. Boy, I can go on and on, Michael. There's just so much of this stuff.
I appreciate your insights here. Believe me, I really do. It's been wild listening to this. And again, it vindicates a lot of things that have been said in the past. A lot of naysayers out there, a lot of the marks, very angry with this sort of thing. But to shift gears just here for a moment, you were saying the biological Paul McCartney. And I just wanted to get into that just for a few moments here. And of course, the theory goes that on, I believe, November 9th of 1966, Paul McCartney was tragically killed in a car crash on his way home from working on, I believe, the Sgt. Pepper album, correct?
The story goes, at least from the standpoint of the memoirs of Billy Shears, that he was getting song assignments from Brian Epstein. Okay. And then when Epstein gave him the song assignments, which is I have said that it's a nonsense story because he wasn't writing anything. But in any case, Paul bolted out of the studio because he was annoyed at how many songs he had to write. But I guess it didn't bother them when they had to write 16, in 30 days for Rubber Soul. But anyway, he got in the car and it was a rainy day and he was driving down the highway. He actually picked up a hitchhiker along the way. We're told in memoirs her name was Donna. And it was soon after that he had an accident. That's the prevailing story around Paul is dead, that it was a car crash. He died in a car crash. But it's also possible that it was a ritual sacrifice. The book refers to it as death for success. I think in terms of like the 27 Club. So
a lot of mysterious deaths happen, as we know.
Well, we can go through a list of all of the members of the 27 Club. Of course, Paul was 20, so he was 24.
24, yeah.
24 in 1966. But, we have Keith Moon of The Who. We have Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones. We've got Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, John Bonham from Led Zeppelin. We can argue that all of these people died before their time. They died young. And not
very
all
young.
And not all of them in the 27 Club. Whenever I go through this, somebody inevitably, a Zeppelin fan, will always say, John Bonham didn't die at 27. I said, I know. I'm just telling you that these people died before their time. I'm just rattling off some names.
And of course, Morrison, as you know, obviously.
Jim Morrison. There's so many of them.
There's a lot.
There's a lot.
Yeah. And by the way, do you have any compelling, maybe forensic or behavioral proofs presented that support a post-1966 replacement?
The proof is that Billy is not Paul McCartney. He's not an identical match. He's not a spitting image of Paul McCartney. And all one needs to do, if they just sit back a little bit and analyze the images over time, you'll see that once we hit 1967 and the release of Sgt. Pepper, we have a different person. In fact, there's a lot of people on my channel, they're older folks like me, and they will write in the comment section or email me and say, Mike, when Sgt. Pepper came out, I remember looking at the cover and looking at this guy that we're told was Paul McCartney and thinking, that's not Paul McCartney. Some people picked it up right away. What happens, Michael, is if you don't line the images up next to each other over time, then you're not going to see the differences.
You won't notice, in other words.
You won't notice. What happens is you're presented with images of Paul McCartney in 1967, and then you see images of Paul McCartney in 1968, or going back to 64 or 65. They're not being laid up against other images of Paul. So you're just taking it at that moment in time, that particular image, and you're told that's Paul McCartney. So you're like, okay, well, that's Paul McCartney.
Yeah, you believe it.
And the thing what they did with the Sgt. Pepper album, with Pepper, they changed the appearance of all of the Beatles. So we had the 62 through 66 period, and we had the mop tops, right?
Right.
Then when you get to Sgt. Pepper, now we have this psychedelic album. We have the Beatles now have a completely different look. Mustaches.
Yeah, after they were in India, dropping acid, all that sort of deal.
We have completely different look, completely different. And the reason why they did that was so that all of the members of the Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, they all look different. So when you're looking at that, you're thinking, well, wow, the whole band changed. Now, if they didn't change John, George, and Ringo, and they just brought Billy in on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, a lot more people probably would have said, who is that? But because they camouflage it with this album cover that just radiates a psychedelic feel to it, the Beatles look completely different. Many people just accepted the fact that, hey, that's Paul McCartney. Because if it's not him, then who is it? It's got to be him. And the other thing that the controllers did, when I talk about the controllers, I'm talking about Tavistock and all of their buddies. They went off and created a composite Paul McCartney. So as time went on, his appearance would alter. And so then what happens is it just becomes a big blur to the fan, to the person that's following the Beatles. And even somebody who doesn't follow the Beatles, it just becomes a big blur. And
that's true, especially if you don't have that in mind, especially, you're not really looking for these things.
Yeah. I mean, the best thing to do, if you want to do a quick comparison, it's one of the charts that I have. I can't show it here, but is go take a look at Paul McCartney in 1964 or 65. And then go take a look at Billy with his mullet in 1975 when he's with Wings. Stare at that picture. You should be walking away thinking to yourself and saying to yourself, that is not the same guy. And the reason is because he's not the same guy. And if you think he's the same guy, then I'm hoping you're never a witness to some kind of crime.
Right.
Okay.
Good point.
So That's what they did. There's a lot of sleight of hand. They have been doctoring images going back from the very beginning. I've noticed images have been doctored over the last 20 to 30 years. We have images where biological Paul's face is blended with Billy's face.
Mm.
In fact, there's one image in particular that goes back to Hamburg, and we're told that's Paul McCartney when he was in Hamburg. I'm like, that is not Paul McCartney in Hamburg. That's a hybrid of Paul and Billy.
And by the way, before I forget, what about his voice? Did that change, alter in any way?
Billy and Paul have different voices. We have to put it into context. Billy has been playing Paul McCartney since 1966, which means he's been at it for 60 years. So when people hear him speak, when people hear him sing or listen to the songs, that's who people know as Paul McCartney. But if you go back and you listen to the early Beatles songs and listen to Paul sing, as an example, Michelle or Yesterday, and then go listen to Billy, it's a different voice. Now, Billy does a very good job of mimicking Paul's voice. I'll give him that, a very good job. But a good test would be listen to the original Yesterday, going back to the Bio-Paul period. And then go get Billy's album, Give My Regards to Broad Street. I think that's the album, where he does a couple of Beatle covers, and Yesterday is one of those songs. And when you put the songs side by side and you listen to them, you can tell that they're different singers. You can also pick up, if you listen very closely, just pay attention, Billy's pronunciation and diction is different than Paul's. It's a different voice, even though I said he does a great job of mimicking.
Mimicking him, right, okay.
Yeah, he does a very good job of it. Now, there was a professor at the University of Miami going back into the 1960s. His name was Dr. Henry Truby. And Dr. Truby was an expert in linguistics and also in sonograms. So sonograms are voice prints. And he took a look at comparing the song Yesterday, the original Yesterday that Paul McCartney sings on, with Hey Jude, and I believe the other song was Penny Lane. He was fully expecting that there was going to be a match. Obviously, Dr. Truby didn't think that they swapped the guy out. Once he got done with his analysis, he came out and said there's a very high likelihood that the person that's singing the song Yesterday is not the same vocalist on Hey Jude and Penny Lane.
Interesting.
Now, some people will say that, and Phil, if you're listening to this, I'm not picking on you, buddy. I love your channel. I was mentioned Phil from Wings of Pegasus. Now,
right.
Phil does these analysis based upon pitch analysis. And this would be auto-tune and pitch correction. And I think he analyzed, maybe it was yesterday. I think it was yesterday. It's going back a while. And he said because of a certain inflection or a certain note or phrase, because it looked similar from song to song, that it proved that it was the same person, that Paul McCartney's always been Paul McCartney. And so what I have been trying to explain to people is that pitch correction technology is not the same thing as biometric voice analysis of voice prints, or what used to be referred to as sonograms.
Right. Yeah, it's a little different.
It's very different. Pitch correction technology, the purpose of it is to modify a singer or a speaker's voice to correct off-key or out-of-tune notes. Right? And that's primarily for improving musical or audio quality. But it's not used, and it cannot be used for identification. Biometric voice analysis, on the other hand, identifies or authenticates individuals based upon unique vocal characteristics, or analyzes voice patterns for insights into identity, emotion, or health. So it examines vocal traits like pitch, tone, cadence, format, frequencies, and speech patterns to create a unique voice print or derive biometric data. So without getting too much more into this, when you call a financial institution or a bank, or maybe even your benefits provider, your health benefits, many times they will recognize you based upon your voice.
Ah, your unique sonic signature of the voice.
Right. So your voice is very much like your fingerprints. It's unique to each individual.
Right.
So when they go about identification, let's say a financial institution like a bank, they're not using pitch analysis. Pitch analysis analyzes the gap between the note that was sung and the target note. So if you sing a note a little flat or a little sharp, the pitch technology can correct that. It could move the slightly sharp or slightly flat note to pitch. But that's not identification. If biological Paul was still alive and he had a bank account with a financial institution and Billy called up to get information about that bank account and the process of identification was biometric voice analysis, Billy wouldn't pass it. He would be denied access to the account. Sometimes people will say, well, when Dr. Truby did his work back in 1968, that was old technology, that was this, that was that. But remember that Dr. Truby was an expert in his field of linguistics and sonograms. In fact, police departments use biometric voice analysis or voice prints to help them solve crimes, not pitch analysis. There's so much to this, Michael.
There's a lot. I know. I mean, it's crazy that it goes this deep. And again, that's more revealing to me than other things I've heard, other theories. And that makes a lot of sense to me. You know, you're speaking a lot of sense here, Mike.
Well, it's been 8 years of looking into it. And what happens, Michael, is when you're doing it for so long, you get a lot of questions. You know, people ask a lot of questions. Right. And a lot of questions are great questions. I'm like, that's a good question. Let me go take a look at that. But the ones where people are pushing the right buttons and asking the right questions, that would set me off to go take a look at, what about that? What about that?
Makes you want to dig deeper. Absolutely. And as we go along here, another thing I wanted to quickly mention were over the years, you had Paul McCartney appearing on the Howard Stern show. Have you checked out any of those interviews? And what did you make of any of those?
The one I watched recently, though, it's funny you should bring this up. I watched it about 2 weeks ago. And Howard was asking Paul McCartney, Billy, if John was gay. And there was always this rumor that was swirling around that he had an affair with Brian Epstein.
Oh my!
Yeah, that's been around for a long time. And what's interesting enough is that Billy kind of answered the question in a weird way. We were good buds and good mates, and I never got the sense that John had a homosexual aspect to his sexuality. Billy was being coy about it. That's how I felt when I was watching the interview. So in other words, he really didn't want to answer it. And by not answering directly, then what happens? The person who's watching is just thinking, well, maybe then he was gay. By the way, I remember Ginger Baker being one of those musicians that said something. Of course, again, Ginger was he was the drummer for Cream. And, right. And possibly another one of the drummers that drummed on Beatles songs. It was an article called Artists Who Zing the Beatles. We had the great jazz musician, Charles Mingus. Charles is considered one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. Unfortunately for him, the mainstream popularity of jazz was in steep decline at the same time as the Beatles were shooting to fame. As a super talented black artist whose commercial appeal was limited by both his musical genre and his race, it would be easy to become cynical about young white guys taking black musical forms and selling them back to mainstream America. So in the early 70s, Mingus unleashed an epic rant about the Beatles and their assimilation of black American sounds. He took things further by suggesting that the Beatles didn't even write their own songs, instead being controlled by some sort of consortium of UK pop masterminds. Now folks, this is not me. This is Charles Mingus, who's considered one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. He says they stole what we call rock, studied it. He goes, not the Beatles, but the great classical minds from England, and they built the Beatles, and the Beatles were a machine. And they promised these kids so much money, and they trained them. They were not musicians when they came. And this is exactly what I was saying before.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, Michael, because I didn't find this article until a number of years after I came out with my presentation back in April of 2020. Did the Beatles write all their own music? So it goes back to what I said before. The information is out there, but you just have to dig and dig and dig, and it'll pop up. And then if you find enough of these pieces, enough of these loose ends here and over there, and you start connecting the dots, then the story starts to come together. The alternative story starts to come together.
Right. Man, you've been on quite a journey, Mike.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and I have to tell you, Michael, I'm glad that it's over.
I know. It is exhausting, I'm sure. One last one in regards to Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
As you know, Michael Jackson purchased the publishing rights to the Beatles music catalog back in '85, I believe.
Yes.
What do you make of that, by the way? What is your analysis on that? 47.5 million.
Yes, and he was bidding with Billy. Billy wanted the rights as well. He wanted the publishing rights. And what Billy said was that it got to the point where it was so much money that he could no longer justify playing the game anymore. So Billy folded his cards. When Michael died, Sony had the publishing to the Beatles songs. There were articles in the newspaper and online where it said that Paul McCartney was suing Sony over the publishing because he wanted a piece of the action. I was told by somebody, and it goes back a number of years ago, and I can't say who these people are. Again, I'm going to have to protect the sources. Yeah.
Right.
Said that what happened was there were many of those songs from the early period that were not Billy's. The songs were credited to Lennon and McCartney. That doesn't mean that Paul McCartney and John Lennon wrote the songs. It goes back to what I said before. Right. Credits to songs can easily be applied based upon signing contracts. And it goes on all the time in the music industry. I was told that during that period of time, when Billy didn't have a piece of the action from the publishing from Sony, he didn't play many songs from the Biopole period. He might play Yesterday or something like that, but it was basically a token number of songs. The reason why he did that was because he wasn't getting a cut of the publishing. So he went to Sony and said, look, I want a cut of the publishing, okay? Which means that the copyrights don't include him. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
It goes back to original Paul and to John Lennon.
Right.
So again, I'm just telling you what I was told. So he has this lawsuit with Sony, and what it's really about is I want a piece of the action of those old songs.
Right. He needs his cut.
And if you don't do it, then I'm not going to play them. And if I don't play them, you're going to be missing out on a lot of money because I'm going to press records from these concerts. I'm going to do DVDs. So eventually what happened was I was told that Sony finally said, okay, fine. Because Billy's attitude was, hey, this is a win-win for both of us. I get a piece of the action. I'll play the songs. Ka-ching. You get money. Ka-ching.
That's right.
I get money. But if you don't do it, I'm not going to touch it. So you're going to be missing out. You're going to have lost revenue because I'm not going to play them and you're not going to see any revenue benefit from that. So that's an interesting story. Right. Again,
it is.
And let me just again tell the audience, I don't know if that's actually what went down. All I can tell you is that is what I was told.
What he's been told, yeah.
It does make sense to me because back in the day when Billy was playing live, before that lawsuit, he wasn't playing a lot of the old songs. And then after the lawsuit, actually what happened was it never went to court. They settled out of court. And then all of a sudden, boom, he's doing all of these Beatles songs. The older Beatles songs.
That's very telling.
It's interesting. Like I said, I'll just throw that out there as just some food for thought for the audience.
It's a hypothesis, in other words.
Yeah, it's a story I was told. We'll just leave it like that.
A little birdie. Anyways, Mike, again, I do want to thank you for being generous with your time. Go ahead and plug anything you like, any final words. The floor is yours, my friend. Go ahead.
It's actually going to be quite quick. If you would like to follow my work, whether it be the Beatles or anything else, I have 2 blogs, one on Substack, one on Blogspot. Cover a lot of ground with a lot of different information, alternative news and research and stuff like that. Just go to my hub website. It's Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY, sageofquay.com. All of my links are there. It's one-stop shop.
Very nice. Once again, thank you so much for your time, my friend. We will do this again. I hope we'll cover other things here aside from the Beatles, but thank you so much, Mike, for doing this, and I will see you on the other side.
Thank you, Michael.